Welcome to the channel. We're so glad you're here. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to click like and subscribe to stay updated with our latest content. Your support helps us create more awesome videos for you. Let us know what you think in the comments below. Enjoy the video. The Shadow of Oakhaven Lodge. Our protagonist, let's call him Ethan, a freelance architect with a penchant for restoring forgotten buildings, received a peculiar commission. He was contacted by Mr. Alistair Fairbanks, an elderly gentleman with a voice that crackled like old parchment over the phone, to renovate a long-abandoned roadside lodge known as Oakhaven. Fairbanks was surprisingly insistent, almost desperate, for the work to be completed swiftly. He offered Ethan a generous sum, enough to make the 2-day drive into the remote countryside worthwhile, and a peculiar condition. Ethan must stay at the lodge, alone, throughout the renovation. Ethan, though initially hesitant about the solitary aspect, accepted. He was a man who preferred the quiet hum of solitude to the cacophony of city life. He packed his truck with supplies, tools, and enough provisions to last several weeks, setting off early one misty morning. The journey was long and winding, taking him through increasingly desolate landscapes. The highway eventually gave way to a narrow, cracked road, lined with skeletal trees that seemed to claw at the overcast sky. When Oakhaven Lodge finally came into view, it was a sight that both intrigued and unsettled him. It was a large, 2-story structure built primarily of dark, weathered wood. Missing shingles peppered the roof like vacant eye sockets, and the windows were clouded with years of grime and neglect. A faded sign, barely clinging to its rusted frame, proclaimed Oakhaven Lodge, rest and repose, a promise that felt both ironic and ominous. The air was unnaturally still.
No bird sang, no insects buzzed.
The only sound was the soft crunch of Ethan's boots on the gravel driveway as he approached. He parked his truck, noting the absence of any other vehicles. The property was utterly deserted, save for a gnarled, dead oak tree that stood sentinel near the empty parking lot, its branches like twisted, arthritic fingers. Mr. Fairbanks had left the keys under a loose stone near the porch, along with a handwritten note reiterating the urgency of the project. Complete the essential work, it read, and prepare for new guests by month's end. Disturb as little as possible. The "as little as possible" phrase caused a tickle on the back of his neck. Ethan unlocked the heavy oak front door, its hinges groaning in protest. The smell that greeted him was a thick blend of mildew, dust, and something faintly metallic, like old blood. The lobby was a cavernous space, dominated by a massive reception desk, its surface scarred with countless scratches and what looked suspiciously like dried stains. Worn, threadbare armchairs lined the walls, and a faded, moth-eaten tapestry depicting a hunting scene hung askew above a cold, unused fireplace. He ventured further, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The ground floor contained a dining area, still furnished with tables and chairs shrouded in white sheets, like ghostly diners awaiting a meal that would never come. There was a small, cluttered kitchen, and a series of what appeared to be guest rooms, each numbered with tarnished brass plates. Ethan made a mental inventory. Strip wallpaper, refinish floors, repair windows, replace damaged furniture, assess structural integrity. It was a daunting task, but the pay was good, and he was a man who prided himself on his craftsmanship. He chose a room on the ground floor, closest to the entrance, as his temporary quarters. It was Spartan, containing only a narrow bed frame and a rickety nightstand. He unrolled his sleeping bag, placed his flashlight, phone charger, and a half-eaten sandwich on the nightstand, and took a deep breath. The silence of the lodge was profound, almost oppressive. It was a silence that seemed to listen. That afternoon, Ethan began the arduous process of stripping wallpaper in the lobby. The paper came away in brittle sheets, revealing cracked plaster underneath. He worked methodically, his only company the sound of his own scraping and the occasional creak of the building settling. The lodge, he noted, felt unusually cold, even for an old, unheated structure. As dusk began to creep in, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and gray. Ethan paused for a break. He stepped out onto the porch, breathing in the slightly fresher air. The wind had picked up, whispering through the branches of the dead oak tree. No cars passed on the distant road. The only movement was the slow sway of the lodge's decaying sign. He felt a prickle of unease, a sense of isolation that went beyond mere solitude. He re-entered the lodge, the heavy door closing behind him with a resounding thud that echoed through the empty space. He climbed the creaking staircase to the second floor, his flashlight beam probing the shadows. The rooms upstairs were much like the one he had claimed, small, bare, and eerily uniform. Each contained a single bed frame, an empty wardrobe, and a small, dust-covered table. As he made his way back down the hallway, a sound stopped him in his tracks. It was a soft, shuffling noise, like footsteps behind him. He spun around, flashlight beam darting, but saw nothing. The hallway was empty. He stood perfectly still, listening. The only sound was his own breathing. He dismissed it as his imagination, the product of a tired mind and a creaky old building. Back in his room, Ethan ate the remainder of his sandwich, the silence amplifying the sound of his chewing. He rolled out his sleeping bag, turned off his flashlight, and lay down. The lodge was utterly quiet, save for the occasional whisper of the wind outside. He closed his eyes, but sleep eluded him. His mind raced, replaying the day's events, the unsettling stillness of the lodge, the strange shuffling sound. After what felt like hours, he finally drifted into an uneasy slumber. He was abruptly awakened by a distinct creaking sound, clearly coming from just outside his door. It was the sound of a floorboard yielding under weight, slow and deliberate. He held his breath, listening intently. The creaking came again, followed by a pause, then another creak. It sounded as if someone was pacing slowly, hesitantly, just beyond his door. Ethan reached for his flashlight, his heart pounding against his ribs. He pointed the beam at the door, illuminating the bare wood and the tarnished brass knob. The creaking stopped. He waited, every muscle tense, listening for any further sound. Silence. He told himself it was the old wood, expanding and contracting with the temperature changes. It was an old building, after all. Old buildings made noises, but the deliberate rhythm of the creaking, the way it had paused when he turned on the light, it felt different, felt intentional. He finally and uneasily drifted to sleep. The weak morning light, filtering through the grimy window, did little to dispel the lingering unease Ethan felt. He got up, his muscles stiff from the uncomfortable bed frame. He noticed something immediately. His toolbox, which he distinctly remembered leaving beside the bed, was now positioned neatly by the door. He blinked, trying to recall if he had moved it himself in a half-asleep state. He was certain he hadn't. He was meticulous about his tools, always placing them within easy reach. He checked the rest of the room. Everything else seemed to be in its place. He ran a hand through his hair, a shiver tracing his spine. The logical explanation was that he had moved it himself, a bout of sleepwalking perhaps. But a nagging doubt persisted. He decided to shake it off, attributing it to the stress of the new environment and the lack of proper sleep. He had work to do. He spent the morning continuing to strip wallpaper, this time tackling one of the upstairs rooms. The paper in this room was different, a faded floral pattern, stained with what looked like water damage. As he peeled away a particularly large section, he noticed something odd. The sheets that had been covering the furniture in that room, the furniture he had distinctly left piled in the center, were now neatly folded and stacked in the corner. He distinctly remembered leaving them draped haphazardly over the chairs and table. He hadn't folded them. He wouldn't have bothered. It was a pointless task in an abandoned lodge. He checked the windows. They were closed, latched from the inside. There were no signs of forced entry, no footprints, no indication that anyone else had been in the room. The air was still and heavy, carrying the faint scent of dust and decay. He felt a growing sense of disorientation, a feeling that the lodge itself was subtly shifting around him. By midday, The unease had solidified into a palpable sense of dread. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was not alone. He took a short break, stepping outside to clear his head. He walked around the perimeter of the lodge, examining the exterior walls for any signs of entry, any clue that someone might be playing tricks on him. He found nothing. The doors were locked, the windows secured. There were no footprints in the overgrown weeds or the patches of bare earth. He returned inside, the heavy silence of the lodge pressing down on him. He resumed his work, trying to focus on the task at hand, but his mind kept returning to the moved toolbox, the folded sheets, the unsettling sounds of the previous night. Around late afternoon, the noises started again. Footsteps, soft and shuffling, always seeming to originate from just beyond his immediate vicinity. When he paused to listen, they stopped. When he resumed working, they returned, a subtle, persistent reminder of his unease. Once, he heard a distinct creak, like a door hinge slowly opening, coming from the second floor. He grabbed his flashlight and rushed upstairs, his heart pounding in his chest. He checked every room, shining the beam into every corner, every closet. All the doors were closed. The silence was absolute, broken only by his own ragged breathing. He called out, his voice sounding strained and thin in the empty hallway. "Is anyone there?" No response, only the oppressive silence of Oakhaven Lodge. That evening, he ate a meager meal of canned beans and crackers, sitting in the lobby with his flashlight on, illuminating the faded tapestry and the dust-covered furniture. He listened intently, trying to discern any pattern to the sounds, any clue to their origin. He heard the wind whistling through cracks in the window frames, the distant rush of a creak, and the occasional creak of the building settling. But he also heard, faintly, the now familiar shuffling footsteps, always just out of reach, always stopping when he tried to pinpoint their source. He decided on a change of sleeping arrangements. He chose a different room, this one on the second floor with a clear view of the front approach. He pushed a heavy oak dresser against the door, creating a makeshift barricade, casting a dim, flickering light across the room. He sat on the bed frame, facing the door, waiting. Around midnight, he heard it again. The whispering. It wasn't the shuffling footsteps, nor the creaking of the building. It was a low, raspy voice, seemingly emanating from just outside the door. He held his breath, listening. The voice whispered a name, repeatedly, in a tone that was both mournful and unsettling. "Arthur! Arthur!" Ethan's blood ran cold. It wasn't his name. His name was Ethan. A cold dread washed over him. He moved the dresser and he quickly opened the door. He saw nothing. Ethan, heart hammering against his ribs, quickly swung the door open, shining the lantern into the hallway. It was empty. The dim light revealed nothing but dust motes dancing in the air and the faded wallpaper peeling from the walls. He stepped out, checking both directions. Nothing. The whispering had stopped. He checked the other rooms on the second floor, one by one. All empty. The silence was heavy, broken only by the creak of the floorboards under his weight. He returned to his chosen room, a growing sense of frustration mixing with his fear. He shoved the dresser back against the door, the scraping sound loud in the quiet hallway. He locked himself in. He didn't sleep. He sat on the bed frame, the lantern casting long, dancing shadows on the walls, listening to every creak, every rustle, every whisper of the wind. He replayed the whispered name in his mind, Arthur. He tried to connect it to something, anything he had read or heard about Oakhaven Lodge, but his memory was blank. As dawn approached, a pale, gray light filtering through the grimy window, the whispering finally ceased. Ethan felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him, but he couldn't bring himself to close his eyes. He waited, tense and alert, until the sun was fully up. He cautiously opened the door, pushing the dresser aside. The hallway was empty, bathed in the weak morning light. He stepped out, checking the floor for any sign of footprints, any indication of who or what had been whispering outside his door. He found nothing. He spent the next day working downstairs, trying to focus on the renovation, but his mind kept drifting back to the events of the previous night. He noticed new, unsettling details. The reception desk drawers, which he had left closed, were now all open. The ledger, a heavy, leather-bound book he had briefly glanced at but not touched, lay open on the floor, its pages yellowed and brittle. He picked it up, carefully turning the pages. The ink was faded, the handwriting a spidery scrawl. It was a record of guests, their names and dates of stay. He scanned the entries, looking for the name Arthur. He saw a few names starting with A, but nothing that matched. The last entry in the ledger was dated over 20 years ago. He closed the ledger, a sense of unease settling over him. He checked the dining area. Some of the chairs, which had been arranged haphazardly, were now positioned in a neat circle, as if for a meeting. There were no footprints, no scuff marks on the dusty floor, nothing to indicate how the chairs had been moved. Ethan felt a growing sense of unreality, as if the lodge was playing a subtle, cruel game with him. He tried to rationalize it, to find logical explanations, but the evidence was mounting. Something was happening in Oakhaven Lodge, something that defied logic. He decided he needed to finish the essential work and leave. He pushed himself harder, working without breaks, ignoring the growing tension in his muscles, the dryness in his throat, the constant feeling of being watched. He painted the lobby walls, replaced some broken floorboards, and installed new light fixtures, the electric hum a welcome distraction from the unsettling silence. As dusk approached, he climbed the stairs one last time, intending to do a final check of the rooms. As he passed the third room on the left, he heard a distinct footstep behind him. He froze, every muscle tense. The hallway felt colder, the air heavy with an almost palpable sense of dread. He slowly turned around. Nothing, but the feeling of being watched intensified. He could feel the hair on the back of his neck prickle. He took a step backward, then another, keeping his eyes fixed on the spot where he had heard the sound. When he reached the top of the stairs, he ran, taking the steps two at a time. He didn't stop until he was back in the lobby, his heart pounding, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He decided he wouldn't spend another night in Oakhaven Lodge. He threw his tools and clothes into his bag, leaving behind anything non-essential. He cleaned up the worst of the mess in the lobby, a perfunctory gesture of completion. He locked the front door, leaving the key under the same loose stone where he had found it. Mr. Fairbanks had paid him in advance, and he had done most of what was asked. The rest, he reasoned, could wait. He just needed to get out. As he carried his bag to his truck, he kept glancing over his shoulder at the lodge, at the dark, empty windows. He didn't see anyone watching him, but he felt it, a presence, a weight, a sense of something unseen lurking just beyond the threshold of perception. He started his truck, the engine roaring to life in the quiet evening. He turned on the headlights, illuminating the front of the lodge. The wind rattled a loose shutter. He didn't hear footsteps. He didn't hear whispering, but the memory of that voice, calling out a stranger's name, sent a shiver down his spine. He drove away, speeding down the narrow road, not looking back. He didn't stop until he reached the next town, the lights of civilization a welcome sight. He never returned to Oakhaven Lodge. He never contacted Mr. Fairbanks again. He received a terse email a week later, asking when he would complete the final details. He lied, claiming a family emergency. He received no further communication. He never learned the full story of Oakhaven Lodge, of Arthur, or of the whispering voice. He had no proof of anything he had experienced, only his memories and a lingering sense of unease. He had done the work he was paid for, or most of it, and that was enough. He just wanted to forget the shadow of Oakhaven Lodge. The figure, Mark, lived alone. He liked quiet. He bought a small house near a dry lake. His agent, Sarah, told him the lake was gone for years. The house was cheap. Mark didn't care. He wanted to be away from the city. The house was one story. It had a living room, a bedroom, a kitchen, and a bathroom. It was old, but Mark liked old things. The lake bed was outside, just dirt and some old wood. On the first night, Mark looked out the window. He saw something. It was far away on the other side of the dry lake. It looked like a person, but it was dark. It had no face. It just stood there, pointed at Mark. Mark felt strange. He felt a weight in his chest. He went back from the window. He told himself it was just a tree. He tried to sleep. He couldn't. The next night, Mark looked again. The figure was there. Same place. Still pointing. No face. Mark opened the door. He stepped outside. He heard bugs. He heard the wind. He did not hear anyone walking. He walked to the side of the house. He used a small flashlight. He looked at the lake bed. The figure was hard to see. It was just a dark shape. Mark waited. It did not move. Mark yelled, "Who's there?" No answer. Mark felt cold. He went back inside. He locked the door. In the morning, Mark went outside. He walked to where the figure stood. The ground was hard. He saw his own footprints. He saw no other footprints. No one had been there. He looked around. Nothing. No tree. No bush. Just dirt. On the third night, Mark looked again. The figure was there. Same spot. Still pointing. Mark tried to open the window. He yelled, "Hey!" No answer. The figure did not move. Mark felt sweat on his face. He locked the window. He had no phone signal. He could not call anyone. He went to bed. He tried to sleep. Then he heard a whisper. Sounded like his name. Came from outside. Mark got up. He turned on the light. The whisper stopped. He went to the living room. He looked out the window. The figure was closer now. It was still pointing. Mark felt scared. He locked all the doors. He closed all the curtains. He lay awake all night. He thought he heard the whisper again. He told himself it was the wind. In the morning, he checked the ground. No footprints. Just his. He tried not to panic. He told himself it was not real. But he remembered the whisper. He remembered the shape. He spent the day trying to fix his phone. He got a small signal. He tried to call a friend, Tom. The call did not go through. He sent a text. It did not send. He told himself he would try again. That night, he closed the curtains early. He turned on the TV. He tried to watch a movie. He got up to get water. He looked out the kitchen window. The figure was there, close to his house now, pointed at him. Mark felt his hand shake. He turned off the light. He looked again. It was still there. He could not see a face. It was like a dark shape of a person. He whispered, "Go away." He heard a scraping sound. Near the porch. He went to the living room. He looked out the front window. The figure was still there, close to the porch. He locked the windows. He checked the back door. Locked. He picked up a wrench. He waited. He heard the whisper again. Said his name. Clear this time. Came from the wall. Mark felt his heart race. He wanted to yell. He could not. He sat on the couch. He held the wrench. He listened. He heard only the whisper. His name. Over and over. After many hours, the sky got light. Mark got up. He looked out the window. The figure was gone. He could not understand. How could something stand there and leave no trace? The watcher in the mire. Clara, a recently widowed woman seeking solace in solitude, decided to relocate to a remote cottage bordering a vast, desolate marshland. The property, known locally as Marsh End, had been remarkably inexpensive, and the estate agent, a Mr. Silas, had been oddly eager to finalize the sale. He'd vaguely mentioned that the previous owner had left abruptly, citing unforeseen circumstances. Clara, desperate for a fresh start and unconcerned by local rumors, dismissed his evasiveness. The cottage was a single-story dwelling, built of sturdy, gray stone. It stood alone, separated from the edge of the marsh by a stretch of cracked, uneven ground that was perpetually damp. The surrounding vegetation was sparse, gnarled, wind-battered trees and clumps of coarse grass that rustled even on the calmest days. The air carried a constant, faintly unpleasant odor of decaying vegetation and stagnant water. Clara moved in during a bleak autumn afternoon. The sky was a uniform gray, and a fine drizzle blurred the horizon, making the marsh seem to extend infinitely. She unloaded her few belongings in a worn suitcase, a box of books, and a small, antique writing desk, and began to settle in. The cottage's interior was basic but clean. There was a single bedroom, a small living area with a stone fireplace, and a kitchen just large enough for a small table and a few cupboards. That first evening, as dusk settled, Clara stood at the living room window, looking out at the marsh. The drizzle had stopped, but the air remained heavy with moisture. As her eyes adjusted to the fading light, she noticed a dark shape in the distance, near the edge of the visible water. It was tall and upright, resembling a human figure, but utterly still. She squinted, thinking it might be a tree stump or a peculiar rock formation. But as she watched, she realized it wasn't a natural feature. It had a distinct, almost angular silhouette. It seemed to be facing the cottage, and one arm was extended, as if pointing directly at her. A shiver ran down her spine. She told herself it was a trick of the light, a product of her grief and the unsettling atmosphere of the place. Clara closed the curtains tightly and lit a small lamp. She tried to read, but her attention kept drifting back to the window, to the image of that dark, unmoving figure. She couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching her. She eventually fell into a restless sleep, plagued by vague, unsettling dreams. The next morning, she ventured outside to explore the area around the cottage. The ground was soft and yielding underfoot, a mixture of mud and decaying leaves. She walked cautiously toward the spot where she'd seen the figure the previous evening. As she drew closer, she found no sign of anything that could have created that silhouette. There were no trees, no large rocks, just the flat, muddy expanse of the marsh. The mud showed her own footprints clearly, but there were no other marks, no indication that anything had stood there. Clara felt a growing sense of unease. She tried to rationalize what she'd seen, attributing it to her imagination, to the stress of her recent loss. But the image of that pointing figure remained vivid in her mind, and a nagging doubt persisted. She returned to the cottage, feeling increasingly isolated and vulnerable. The marsh, with its silent, watchful presence, had begun to feel less like a refuge and more like a threat. That evening, Clara made a point of securing the cottage before dark. She checked all the windows, ensuring they were latched, and bolted the heavy wooden front door. She lit a fire in the fireplace, hoping the warmth and light would dispel the growing chill she felt, a chill that seemed to emanate from the marsh itself. She tried to distract herself by unpacking her books, arranging them on a small shelf near the fireplace. But her gaze kept drifting to the windows, to the curtains that concealed the darkening marsh. She couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. As the night deepened, the wind picked up, rattling the window panes and whistling through the gaps in the old stone walls. Clara sat in a worn armchair, wrapped in a blanket, trying to read. But the words on the page seemed to blur, and her mind kept replaying the image of the figure in the marsh. Then she heard it, a faint whisper, seemingly just outside the window. It was so soft that she initially dismissed it as the wind. But it came again, a little clearer this time, a sibilant sound that seemed to form her name. Eleanor! Clara froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She slowly lowered her book, listening intently. The whisper came again, closer now, as if someone were pressing their lips against the glass. Eleanor! She rose from the chair, her legs trembling. She moved cautiously toward the window, her hand reaching for the heavy curtains. She hesitated, her breath catching in her throat. The whisper came again, more insistent now. Eleanor! Come. A wave of fear washed over her. She could no longer deny that something was out there, something that knew her name, something that wanted her attention. She pulled the curtains open a fraction of an inch, peering out into the darkness. At first, she saw nothing but the reflection of the lamplight on the glass. Then, as her eyes adjusted, she saw it, the figure, standing much closer to the cottage now, no longer at the edge of the visible water, but halfway across the muddy ground. It was still just a dark silhouette, but she could make out the shape of its head, its long, thin arms, and the way it seemed to lean forward, as if straining to reach her. Clara gasped, stumbling backward, away from the window. She felt a cold dread grip her, a primal fear that transcended rational thought. She locked all of the windows. She wanted to run, to escape the cottage and its oppressive atmosphere, but she knew she was trapped. The nearest village was miles away, and the marsh in the darkness was a treacherous maze. She spent the rest of the night huddled in the armchair, the fire burning low, listening to the whispers that seemed to seep through the walls, calling her name, beckoning her to the marsh. She didn't sleep. She just waited, her eyes fixed on the curtains, her body tense, her mind racing. As dawn approached, the whispers gradually faded, and the figure, she assumed, retreated back into the depths of the marsh. But Clara knew it would return. She knew that she was not alone at Marsh End, and that whatever lurked out there, in the mist and the mud, was patiently, relentlessly waiting for her. She was trapped in a terrifying game of cat and mouse, with no escape in sight. The House of Shifting Halls. James, an amateur historian with a fascination for lost architecture, stumbled upon a peculiar lead. A crumpled, anonymous note, tucked into an old book he'd purchased at a flea market, contained a crude map and a single sentence. Midnight, under the oak, where the Blackwood House was. Intrigued, James recognized the name Blackwood House, a local legend. A grand mansion said to have vanished without a trace over a century ago, leaving behind only an empty field and whispers of strange occurrences. Driven by curiosity and the allure of the unknown, James decided to follow the map. He arrived at the designated location, a sprawling, overgrown field bordered by ancient oak trees, just before midnight. The full moon cast long, eerie shadows, and a light mist hung in the air, giving the scene an almost theatrical quality. He located the specific oak tree indicated on the map, a massive, gnarled specimen with branches that reached out like skeletal arms. He stood beneath the oak, flashlight in hand, examining the ground. There was nothing, just grass, weeds, and the occasional rock. He consulted the map again. It showed a simple outline of the house, a rectangle with a few internal lines suggesting rooms and hallways. He paced around, trying to match the map to the terrain, but nothing correlated. He was about to dismiss the whole thing as a hoax when he noticed a subtle shimmer in the air, a distortion of the moonlight. He held his breath, watching. The shimmer grew more defined, resolving itself into a faint, rectangular outline, hovering just above the ground. It was the outline of a house, matching the shape on the map. James felt a surge of adrenaline, mixed with a prickle of fear. He reached out, his hand passing through the shimmering outline without resistance. The air within the outline felt noticeably colder. He took a deep breath and stepped forward, crossing the threshold of the vanished house. As he did so, the world around him seemed to twist and blur. The moonlight faded, replaced by a dim, diffuse glow that seemed to emanate from the air itself. He found himself standing in a long, narrow hallway. The walls were paneled in dark wood, and the floorboards creaked under his weight. The air was heavy with the scent of dust and decay. He switched on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom. The hallway stretched out before him, lined with closed doors. There was no sign of the outside world, no indication of the field or the oak tree. He was inside the Blackwood House, a house that shouldn't exist. He started to walk, his footsteps echoing strangely in the silence. He tried a door handle, it turned smoothly, and the door opened onto another hallway, identical to the first. He closed the door and tried another. It led to a small, empty room with bare walls and a cracked window. He tried a third door and a fourth, each revealing a different space, a library with empty shelves, a dining room with a collapsed table, a bedroom with a rusted bed frame. But none of the rooms or hallways seemed to connect in a logical way. The layout of the house was constantly shifting, rearranging itself. He'd turn around and find that the hallway behind him had changed, that doors had appeared or vanished, that the angles of the walls were slightly different. He began to hear sounds, faint whispers, the rustle of unseen fabric, the creak of floorboards in the distance. He called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" But his voice was swallowed by the silence. He tried to retrace his steps, to find the entrance, but it was impossible. The hallways twisted and turned, leading him in circles. He felt a growing sense of disorientation, of being utterly lost in a labyrinth that defied the laws of space and time. The Blackwood house was not just a ghost. It was a maze, a trap, a puzzle with no solution. He started to feel panicked. James pressed on, trying to maintain a sense of calm, but his heart was pounding. He pulled out the crumpled map from his pocket, hoping it might offer some clue, some guidance. But the map, too, had changed. The lines representing the rooms and hallways were now a jumble of intersecting lines, a chaotic scribble that made no sense. He realized he was not just exploring a haunted house. He was trapped inside a shifting, unpredictable reality. The laws of physics seemed to have no meaning here. He could walk for hours and end up back where he started, or open a door and find himself in a completely different part of the house. He continued to hear the whispers, growing slightly louder now, although he still couldn't make out any words. They seemed to come from the walls themselves, from the air around him. He also began to smell something, a faint, sweet odor, like decaying flowers. He came to a large, ornate door, different from the others he'd encountered. It was made of dark, polished wood, with intricate carvings of twisting vines and strange, grotesque faces. He hesitated, a sense of dread washing over him. He had a feeling that this door was different, that it led somewhere significant. He reached out and turned the handle. The door opened silently, revealing a large, circular room. The room was dimly lit by a single, flickering chandelier hanging from the high, vaulted ceiling. The walls were lined with bookshelves, filled with ancient, leather-bound tomes. In the center of the room stood a large, ornate table, covered with a velvet cloth. And on the table he saw it a single, open book. The book was large and heavy, bound in dark leather. Its pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with strange symbols and diagrams. As James approached, he noticed that the symbols on the page were moving, shifting, rearranging themselves, just like the hallways of the house. He felt an irresistible urge to touch the book, to read the words, to understand the secrets it held. But he also felt a deep sense of foreboding, a warning that this was a dangerous path, a path that might lead to no return. He reached out his hand, his fingers trembling. As his fingertips brushed the cover of the book, he heard a voice, clear and distinct, speaking his name, James. The voice seemed to come from the book itself, from the air around him, from everywhere and nowhere at once. He recoiled, stumbling backward, away from the table. The chandelier above him swayed, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The whispers intensified, swirling around him like a vortex. He felt a pressure in his head, a sense of being pulled in two directions, drawn to the book and yet terrified of what it might reveal. He knew he had to make a choice, embrace the mystery of the Blackwood house, or find a way to escape before he was lost forever within its shifting walls. His breath was short, his heart was like a drum, and all the hallways were starting to spin. He put his hands to his head and tried to take a step back. James squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the swirling chaos of the room, the whispering voices, the swaying chandelier. He focused on his breathing, forcing himself to take slow, deep breaths, trying to regain some semblance of control. He opened his eyes, and for a moment, the room seemed to solidify, the movement slowing, the whispers fading. He realized that the book was the key, the source of the house's power, its shifting reality. He had to get away from it. He turned and ran, not looking back, not caring where he was going, just putting as much distance as possible between himself and that circular room. He ran through the twisting hallways, ignoring the doors that appeared and disappeared, the whispers that chased him, the shifting floorboards under his feet. He had no sense of direction, no idea if he was heading towards an exit or deeper into the maze. He just ran, propelled by a primal instinct to survive, to escape the suffocating presence of the Blackwood house. He stumbled, nearly falling, catching himself on a wall. He felt something cold and smooth under his hand, a doorknob. He hadn't seen a door there before, but he didn't hesitate. He turned the knob and pushed, stumbling through the opening. He found himself in another hallway, but this one was different. It was narrower, the walls were closer together, and the air was colder, carrying a faint scent of fresh air. He saw a faint light at the end of the hallway, a sliver of moonlight. Hope surged through him. He ran towards the light, his footsteps echoing in the narrow passage. He reached the end, and there it was, an open doorway leading to the outside, to the field, to the oak tree. He didn't hesitate. He burst through the doorway, stumbling out into the night air. He gasped, filling his lungs with the cool, clean air, feeling the damp grass under his feet. He turned and looked back. The outline of the house was gone. There was nothing there but the empty field, the ancient oak tree, and the faint mist hanging in the air. The Blackwood house had vanished, as if it had never been. James stood there for a long moment, shaking, his heart still pounding. He looked down at his hands. They were covered in a fine layer of dust, the same dust he'd smelled inside the house. He wiped them on his jeans, but the faint scent of decay lingered. He knew he would never forget his experience in the Blackwood house. He had glimpsed something beyond the realm of normal understanding, something ancient and powerful, something that defied the laws of reality. He had escaped, but he knew that a part of him would always remain trapped within those shifting walls, lost in the labyrinth of its endless corridors. He walked to his car, got in and left. The whispers in Stone. Professor Amelia Stone, an anthropologist specializing in obscure folklore, received an invitation she couldn't refuse. A colleague, Dr. Thomas Ashton, had stumbled upon a remote village nestled high in the unforgiving Carpathian Mountains, a place whispered about in local legends but dismissed as myth. The village, called Cayman, was said to be inhabited by a reclusive community, fiercely protective of their ancient customs and strangely resistant to outsiders. Dr. Ashton's brief, cryptic message hinted at something extraordinary, a living connection to a forgotten, pre-Christian deity, a being said to reside within the very stones of the village itself. Amelia, despite her skepticism, was intrigued. She packed her research gear, notebooks, recording equipment, a sturdy camera, and a well-worn copy of Fraser's The Golden Bough, and set off on the arduous journey. The approach to Cayman was a test of endurance. The road, little more than a rutted track, wound its way through dense forests and across treacherous mountain passes. The air grew progressively colder, and the landscape became increasingly stark and forbidding. Finally, she arrived. Cayman was a cluster of ancient stone houses, clinging to a steep hillside. The buildings were constructed of rough-hewn granite blocks, their roofs covered in thick slate tiles. The entire village seemed to have grown organically out of the mountain itself, a seamless blend of nature and human construction. But it was the silence that struck Amelia most profoundly. There were no sounds of children playing, no music, no animals. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as it passed through the narrow, winding streets. She found the house Dr. Ashton had indicated in his message, a small, two-story structure near the edge of the village. The door was unlocked. She entered cautiously, calling out Dr. Ashton's name. There was no reply. The house was sparsely furnished. A wooden table, a few chairs, a narrow bed in a corner. A fire had recently burned in the hearth, leaving behind a faint scent of wood smoke. On the table, she found Dr. Ashton's notebook, open to a page filled with frantic scribbles and sketches of strange, angular symbols. As Amelia began to read, she heard it, a faint tapping sound, coming from within the walls. It was a rhythmic, deliberate sound, like knuckles rapping on stone. She pressed her ear against the wall, listening. The tapping stopped. She moved to another wall, and the tapping resumed, seemingly emanating from the very core of the stone itself. She felt a chill run down her spine. This was no ordinary sound. This was something else. She started to get unnerved, and it wasn't like her. Amelia spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the village, trying to engage the inhabitants in conversation. But the villagers, dressed in drab, homespun clothing, were wary and uncommunicative. They spoke in a guttural dialect she could barely understand, and their eyes, dark and deep-set, seemed to hold a mixture of suspicion and fear. She tried asking about Dr. Ashton, but they either ignored her or responded with curt, evasive answers. She showed them his notebook, pointing to the strange symbols, but they recoiled as if she had presented them with something dangerous, something forbidden. As dusk settled, the silence of the village deepened, becoming almost oppressive. Amelia returned to Dr. Ashton's house, feeling a growing sense of unease. She lit a small oil lamp, the flickering light casting long, dancing shadows on the stone walls. She sat at the table, rereading Dr. Ashton's notes. He had described the villagers' belief in a being they called Kaminyar, the stone dweller. He wrote of rituals performed in secret, of offerings made to appease the entity, of a deep, abiding fear that permeated every aspect of their lives. He had also noted the strange sounds, the tapping and whispering he had heard within the walls, and his growing conviction that Kaminyar was not just a myth, but a real, tangible presence. As Amelia read, the tapping started again, louder this time, more insistent. It seemed to be coming from all around her, from every wall, from the floor, from the ceiling. She stood up, her heart pounding, and shone the lamp on the walls. The stones themselves seemed to be vibrating, pulsing with a low, rhythmic hum. She pressed her hand against the cold, rough surface and felt a distinct tremor, a subtle but undeniable movement. Then she heard the whispers. They were faint at first, barely audible above the tapping, but they grew steadily louder, coalescing into a chorus of voices, murmuring in a language she didn't understand, yet somehow felt deep within her bones. The whispers seemed to be speaking directly to her, calling her name, beckoning her to something. Amelia felt a wave of dizziness, a sense of disorientation. The room seemed to spin, the stone walls closing in on her. She stumbled backward, knocking against the table, sending Dr. Ashton's notebook tumbling to the floor. As the notebook fell, a single sheet of paper slipped out, revealing a drawing on the back. It was a crude but powerful depiction of a humanoid figure, its body composed of jagged stone blocks, its eyes glowing with an eerie, internal light. Beneath the drawing, a single word was scrawled in Dr. Ashton's handwriting, Kaminyar. Amelia stared at the drawing, a cold dread gripping her. She knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that she was not alone in this village, that she was in the presence of something ancient, powerful, and profoundly unsettling. The stone was alive. Amelia backed away from the drawing, her eyes darting around the room. The tapping had intensified, evolving into a deep, resonant pounding that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. The whispers were louder now, a cacophony of voices that filled her head, making it impossible to think clearly. She felt a desperate urge to flee, to escape the suffocating presence of the village and its stone dweller. But she also felt a strange, compelling curiosity, a desire to understand the mystery, to uncover the truth behind the legends. She picked up Dr. Ashton's notebook, clutching it tightly in her hand. She had to find him. He was the key to understanding what was happening. She moved towards the door, but as she reached for the handle, she heard a voice, clear and distinct, speaking inside her head. It was not a whisper, but a resonant, booming voice that seemed to vibrate through her very being. "Stay," the voice commanded. Amelia froze, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She slowly turned, her eyes scanning the room. There was no one there, only the stone walls, the flickering lamplight, and the relentless pounding that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I am Kaminyar," the voice replied. "The heart of this place, the soul of the stone." Amelia felt a wave of fear wash over her, but she stood her ground, forcing herself to meet the unseen presence. "What do you want?" she asked. "You seek knowledge," the voice said. "You seek understanding. I can give you that, but you must be willing to listen. You must be willing to become one with the stone." The room grew colder. Amelia could see her breath in the air. The pounding intensified, and the stone walls seemed to press inward, as if the house itself were a living thing, constricting around her. She realized that she was facing a choice between fleeing in terror and embracing the terrifying unknown. She could run, try to escape the village and its ancient secrets, or she could stay and risk losing herself in the heart of the stone. She felt Dr. Ashton's book in her hand, and she knew the choice was already made. Amelia took a deep, shaky breath, trying to calm the frantic beating of her heart. She looked down at Dr. Ashton's notebook, at the drawing of the stone figure, and a strange sense of resolve began to replace her fear. She had come to Cayman seeking answers, and now it seemed the answers were seeking her. I want to understand," she said, her voice still trembling, but firmer now. The pounding subsided slightly, the pressure in the room easing. The voice of Kamenyar spoke again, softer this time, less commanding, more persuasive. "Then listen," it said. "Listen to the stone. Listen to the whispers. Listen to the heart of Cayman." Amelia closed her eyes, focusing on the sounds around her. The whispers, which had previously been a chaotic jumble, began to resolve themselves into individual voices, each with its own distinct tone and cadence. She heard the voices of men, women, and children, speaking in the ancient dialect of the villagers, their words weaving a tapestry of stories, of legends, of lives lived and lost within the embrace of the mountain. She heard tales of hardship, of survival, of a deep connection to the land and the stone. She heard of rituals performed under the pale moonlight, of offerings made to appease the spirits of the mountain, of a pact made long ago between the villagers and Kamenyar, a pact that bound them to the stone for eternity. She began to understand. Kamenyar was not a malevolent entity, not a monster to be feared. It was the collective consciousness of the village, the accumulated memories, emotions, and experiences of generations, imprinted upon the very fabric of the stone itself. It was the living history of Cayman, a history that was both beautiful and terrifying. As she listened, the stone walls around her seemed to dissolve, replaced by visions, by fleeting glimpses of the past. She saw the villagers, their faces weathered and lined, working the land, building their homes, raising their families. She saw them celebrating festivals, mourning their dead, performing their ancient rituals. She saw their lives, their struggles, their hopes, their fears, all unfolding before her in a dizzying, overwhelming panorama. She felt a strange connection to these people, to their history, to their deep, abiding relationship with the stone. She felt herself being drawn into their world, becoming a part of their collective memory, a part of Kamenyar itself. Then, she saw Dr. Ashton. He was standing in this very room, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and fascination. He was holding his notebook, scribbling frantically, trying to capture the essence of what he was experiencing. She saw him reach out and touch the stone wall, his fingers tracing the outlines of the strange symbols. She saw him whisper to the stone, asking questions, seeking answers. And then, she saw him change. His body began to stiffen, his skin taking on a grayish hue. His eyes lost their focus, becoming blank and empty, like polished stones. He was becoming one with the wall. He was joining Kamenyar. Amelia gasped, pulling back from the vision, her mind reeling. She understood now what had happened to Dr. Ashton, what the villagers had been so afraid to tell her. Kamenyar did not kill. It absorbed. It incorporated the living into its stony embrace, adding their memories, their experiences, their very essence to its own. And that was her fate too, she knew it. Amelia stumbled back, away from the wall, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. The visions receded, the whispers softened, the pounding in the walls diminished to a gentle throb. The room returned to its former state, dim and dusty, the stone walls cold and solid once more. But she was no longer the same. She had seen too much, felt too much. She had glimpsed the true nature of Kamenyar, and the knowledge was both exhilarating and terrifying. She looked down at her hands. They were trembling, but they were still flesh and blood, not stone. She was still herself, still separate from the collective consciousness of the village. But for how long? The voice of Kamenyar spoke again, a gentle murmur in her mind. Do not be afraid, Eleanor. Using her real name, you have been chosen. You have been given a gift, the chance to become a part of something greater than yourself, to transcend the limitations of your mortal existence, to live forever within the heart of Cayman. Amelia shook her head, a desperate plea escaping her lips. No, I don't want this. I want to go home. The voice chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. There is no home for you now, Eleanor. Only Cayman. Only the stone. She felt a pull, a subtle but irresistible force drawing her towards the wall. She resisted, digging her heels into the floor, clinging to her individuality, to her memories of a life beyond the village. But the pull was growing stronger, the whispers more insistent, the pounding of the stone a relentless rhythm that echoed the frantic beating of her own heart. She knew she couldn't fight it forever. Kamenyar was patient, eternal, could wait. She closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. She thought of her life, of her friends, of her family, of all the things she would never experience again. She thought of the warmth of the sun on her skin, the taste of fresh bread, the sound of laughter. All of it would be lost, swallowed by the cold, silent embrace of the stone. Then, a new thought emerged, a flicker of defiance in the face of overwhelming despair. She had come to Cayman seeking knowledge, seeking understanding, and she had found it in a way she could never have imagined. She had glimpsed the truth behind the legends, the reality of a being that existed beyond human comprehension. And perhaps, just perhaps, there was a way to use that knowledge to bargain with Kamenyar, to find a compromise, a way to preserve her own identity while still honoring the ancient pact. She opened her eyes, her gaze fixed on the stone wall. She took a deep breath and spoke, her voice clear and strong, despite the tremor in her hands. Kamenyar, she said, I understand you now. I understand your power, your history, your connection to this place. But I am not ready to become one with the stone. Not yet. I have a life, a purpose beyond these walls. I ask you, grant me a reprieve. Let me leave this village and I will tell your story. I will share the knowledge I have gained, so that others may understand the truth of Cayman. I will be your voice, your emissary, to the outside world. The pounding stopped. The whispers faded. The room fell silent, except for the faint crackling of the oil lamp. Amelia held her breath, waiting, her body tense, her mind racing. Then the voice of Kamenyar spoke one last time, its tone different, not commanding, not persuasive, but resigned. So be it, it said. Go, tell our story. But know this, Eleanor, the stone always remembers. The pressure in the room vanished. The cold receded. Amelia felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her, but also a sense of relief, of liberation. She had been spared, for now. She stumbled back towards the door, her legs weak, her mind still reeling from the experience. She left the house, leaving Dr. Ashton's notebook behind, a silent testament to the power of Kamenyar. She walked through the silent village, past the wary eyes of the villagers, and out onto the mountain path. She never looked back. Amelia kept her promise. She wrote about Cayman, about Kamenyar, about the living stone and the whispers in the walls. Her account was met with skepticism, with disbelief, but she persisted, driven by the memory of that night, by the voice of the stone, by the knowledge that she carried within her. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls outside her window, she can still hear the faint tapping, the distant whispers, the echo of Kamenyar, reminding her that the stone always remembers. Her story wasn't over. The composer's curse. Benjamin, a struggling musicologist, received an unexpected inheritance. A dilapidated, long-abandoned music studio from a great-uncle he barely knew, a once-renowned composer named Arthur Mallory. The studio, located in a quiet, almost forgotten corner of the city, was rumored to be cursed, the source of Mallory's creative genius and, ultimately, his descent into madness. Benjamin, initially skeptical of the rumors, saw the studio as an opportunity. He was desperate for inspiration, his own compositions feeling stale and uninspired. He hoped that by immersing himself in Mallory's environment, by studying his work, he might unlock some hidden spark, some forgotten technique. He received the keys from a nervous, tight-lipped lawyer who refused to answer any questions about the studio or Arthur Mallory's past. He simply handed over the keys and a thick, sealed envelope, muttering something about unfinished business. The studio was a single, large room, accessible through a narrow hallway in a crumbling old building. The air inside was thick with dust and the scent of decaying wood. A grand piano dominated the center of the room, its keys yellowed and chipped, its surface covered in a layer of grime. Shelves lined the walls, overflowing with stacks of sheet music, notebooks, and strange, unidentifiable objects. A large, ornate mirror, its frame intricately carved with musical instruments and grotesque faces, hung on one wall. Benjamin felt a thrill of excitement, mixed with a sense of unease. This was a treasure trove of musical history, a window into the mind of a forgotten genius. But it was also a place of shadows, of whispers, of a lingering darkness that he couldn't quite explain. He began to explore, carefully examining the sheet music, the notebooks, the strange instruments. He found scores for symphonies, concertos, operas, all bearing Mallory's distinctive, elegant handwriting. But he also found other pieces, fragments of compositions that were unlike anything he'd ever seen before. These unfinished works were filled with bizarre notations, dissonant chords, and unsettling rhythmic patterns. They seemed to defy the rules of conventional music theory, pushing the boundaries of harmony and melody into a realm of unsettling chaos. And on the margins of these scores, Mallory had scrawled cryptic notes. Do not complete. The listener must be prepared. The silence between the notes. He had strange symbols and notes that made Benjamin's head ache. Intrigued, Benjamin sat at the piano, placing one of the unfinished scores on the music stand. He hesitated, a sense of foreboding washing over him. But his curiosity, his desire for inspiration, overcame his apprehension. He began to play. The notes sounded strange, discordant, almost painful to the ear. The air in the room seemed to vibrate, and a cold draft swept through the studio, despite the closed windows. He stopped playing, and the room fell silent except for a faint, high-pitched ringing in his ears. He looked around, feeling a growing sense of unease. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen, and the carved faces on the mirror frame seemed to leer at him. He told himself it was just his imagination, the product of the strange music and the unsettling atmosphere. He tried playing another passage, a series of rapidly repeating chords that seemed to build to an unbearable crescendo. As he played, he heard a sound behind him, a soft, shuffling sound, like someone dragging their feet across the floor. He stopped playing and spun around, his heart pounding. There was nothing there, only the empty room, the dusty shelves, the silent piano. He was alone, but as he turned back to the piano, he saw it a reflection in the mirror. A figure, tall and gaunt, standing behind him, holding a violin. The figure was shrouded in shadow, its face obscured, but he could see the gleam of the violin's strings, the curve of the bow. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. He slowly turned his head, looking over his shoulder. There was nothing there. He turned back to the mirror. The figure was gone. Benjamin stared at the mirror, his mind racing, trying to make sense of what he'd seen. He rubbed his eyes, telling himself it was a hallucination, a trick of the light, a product of his overactive imagination. But deep down, he knew it was something more. He cautiously approached the mirror, examining his own reflection. He looked pale and shaken, his eyes wide with fear. He touched the glass. It was cold and smooth. He looked around the room again, searching for any sign of the figure, any explanation for what he'd seen. He decided to try playing the music again. A different passage this time, a slower, more melodic section. As the notes filled the room, he felt a change in the atmosphere, a subtle shift in the air pressure. He glanced at the mirror. The figure was back. This time it was clearer, more defined. He could see the outline of its long, bony fingers, the way it held the violin, the way its head was tilted slightly, as if listening intently. He could almost make out the features of its face, hollow cheeks, sunken eyes, a thin, cruel mouth. He stopped playing and the figure vanished. He started playing again and it reappeared. He realized that the figure was somehow connected to the music, to the unfinished scores of Arthur Mallory. It was as if the music were summoning it, bringing it into existence. He felt a surge of fear, but also a strange fascination. He wanted to understand what was happening, to unravel the mystery of the studio and its spectral violinist. He wanted to know what secrets Arthur Mallory had discovered, what dark forces he had unleashed through his music. He decided to examine the envelope the lawyer had given him, the one with the unfinished business. He found it tucked away in a drawer, beneath a pile of old letters. He carefully opened it, his hands trembling slightly. Inside, he found a single sheet of paper, covered in Mallory's frantic handwriting. It was a confession, a warning, a desperate plea for help. Mallory wrote of his obsession with creating the perfect music, music that transcended the limitations of human expression, music that could unlock the secrets of the universe. He wrote of his experiments with forbidden harmonies, with ancient scales, with rhythms that defied the natural order. He wrote of a presence he had summoned through his music, a being from another dimension, a creature of pure sound, a violinist of unimaginable skill and terrifying power. He wrote of his attempts to control this being, to harness its power for his own creative ends. But he had failed. The violinist had become his master, demanding more and more complex, more and more dissonant music, feeding on his energy, driving him to the brink of madness. Mallory had tried to stop, to destroy his unfinished scores, but the violinist wouldn't let him. It had trapped him in the studio, forcing him to compose, to play, to serve its insatiable hunger for sound. The last sentence of the note was chilling. Do not complete the scores. Do not listen to the silence. Do not look in the mirror. He realized what he needed to do. Benjamin dropped the note, his hands shaking. He understood now the true nature of his inheritance, the terrible legacy of Arthur Mallory. He was not just in a haunted studio. He was in a trap, a prison built of sound and shadow. He looked at the piano, at the unfinished scores, and felt a wave of dread wash over him. He had been playing Mallory's music, unknowingly summoning the very entity his great-uncle had warned him about. He had been feeding the violinist, strengthening its presence, inviting it into his world. He knew he had to destroy the scores to break the cycle, to silence the music. But as he reached for the nearest sheet, he hesitated. A strange compulsion washed over him, a desire to hear the music, to complete the unfinished pieces, to experience the power that Mallory had described. He fought against it, reminding himself of Mallory's warning, of the madness that had consumed him. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. He had to be strong. He grabbed the scores one by one and began to tear them into pieces. The paper was old and brittle, easily ripped. As he tore the pages, he heard a sound, a low, mournful wail, coming from the mirror. He looked up. The violinist was there, in the reflection, its form clearer than ever before. He could see its face now, a skeletal visage, with empty eye sockets and a gaping mouth that seemed to stretch into an endless void. The violinist raised its bow and began to play, But the sound that came from the mirror was not music. It was a cacophony, a discordant shriek that pierced Benjamin's ears, making his head pound, his vision blur. He covered his ears, but the sound seemed to penetrate his skull, vibrating through his bones. He stumbled backward, away from the mirror, knocking over a chair. The room began to spin, the walls seeming to melt and distort. He felt a cold, clammy hand grip his shoulder, and he screamed. He looked down, expecting to see the skeletal hand of the violinist, but there was nothing there. He was alone in the room, yet he felt the presence all around him, pressing in on him, suffocating him. The wailing from the mirror intensified, reaching a deafening crescendo. Benjamin felt his sanity slipping, his mind unraveling. He knew he had to escape, to get out of the studio before it was too late. He could feel the presence in the mirror drawing closer. He had to hurry. Benjamin scrambled to his feet, his legs wobbly, his head spinning. He staggered towards the door, his vision blurred by tears, his ears ringing with the unbearable noise from the mirror. He reached for the doorknob, his hand shaking so violently he could barely grasp it. He fumbled with the latch, his fingers slipping on the cold metal. The wailing from the mirror grew louder, more intense, as if the violinist were mocking his desperate attempt to escape. Finally, the door swung open. Benjamin stumbled out into the hallway, slamming the door shut behind him. The sound from the mirror was muffled, but still audible, a persistent, throbbing pain in his head. He leaned against the wall, gasping for breath, his body trembling uncontrollably. He looked down the hallway, towards the entrance of the building, his only way out. But the hallway was no longer empty. Standing between him and the exit were figures, shadowy and indistinct, but undeniably there. They were the same skeletal shapes he had seen in the mirror's reflection when he used the camera's flash in the old mansion. Only now they were real, not confined to a reflection, not dependent on a burst of light. They stood motionless, blocking his path, their empty eye sockets fixed on him. He could feel their presence, a cold, oppressive weight that made it difficult to breathe. He knew he couldn't fight them. He was unarmed, exhausted, and terrified. His only chance was to run, to try to evade them, to find another way out. He turned and ran back towards the studio, his footsteps echoing in the narrow hallway. He heard the figures behind him, their movements silent, but he could sense them following him, closing in. He burst back into the studio, the wailing from the mirror hitting him like a physical blow. He looked around wildly, searching for another exit, another door, a window, anything. There was nothing. The studio was a sealed box, a trap designed to hold him, to feed him to the violinist. He saw the piano still open, the torn fragments of Mallory's scores scattered on the floor. He had an idea, a desperate, last-ditch attempt to break the cycle, to silence the music, to banish the violinist. He stumbled towards the piano, his legs heavy, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He reached out and slammed his hands down on the keys, producing a jarring, dissonant chord, a sound that was the antithesis of music, a pure expression of chaos and despair. The wailing from the mirror stopped. The figures in the hallway vanished. The room fell silent. The reflection in the mirror started to fade. Benjamin stood there, his hands still resting on the cold keys, his body trembling with exhaustion and relief. He listened, holding his breath, waiting for the sounds to return, for the figures to reappear. But there was only silence. He slowly raised his head and looked at the mirror. His own reflection stared back at him, pale and shaken, but alone. The violinist was gone. He had done it. He had broken the cycle, silenced the music, banished the entity that had haunted the studio for so long. But the victory felt hollow. He was left with the silence, the emptiness, the lingering scent of decay, and the knowledge of what he had experienced. He stumbled back to his bag and retrieved the torn remains of Arthur's compositions. He hesitated, looking down at the music, the same music that had almost driven two men to madness. He knew in his heart that the only way to truly be rid of the curse was to take no chances. He would burn the music. He carefully left the studio for the last time. He did not go back to his flat. He went to a nearby park, and in a metal trash can, he set the pages alight. Watching as the fire turned the notes into ashes that would be scattered to the wind, never able to be played again. He knew the studio would still stand, empty and silent, a monument to a forgotten composer and his terrifying creation. But the music, the source of its power, was gone. And Benjamin, though forever scarred by his experience, was free. He was free to create his own music, to find his own voice, to live his own life, without the shadow of the violinist hanging over him. He went home, and for the first time in a week, he could rest without worry. The whispers of Windrow Farm. Daniel inherited his grandfather's farm, a sprawling, neglected property named Windrow, located miles from the nearest town. He remembered visiting as a child, enchanted by the rambling old barn, the fields of swaying wheat, and the stories his grandfather, Silas, used to tell. But Silas had passed away years ago, and the farm had fallen into disrepair. Daniel, recently laid off from his city job, saw it as a chance for a fresh start, a return to a simpler life. He arrived on a blustery autumn evening. The wind howled through the bare branches of the trees, and the old farmhouse creaked and groaned like a living thing. The barn, a massive, weathered structure with a sagging roof, stood silhouetted against the darkening sky. It was larger than he remembered, its presence both imposing and strangely comforting. Daniel's mother had warned him about the barn. She told him stories of strange noises, of whispers in the night, of a presence that Silas had always attributed to the wind or old timbers settling. She'd urged him to tear it down, to replace it with something modern and safe. But Daniel, drawn to the past, to the tangible connection to his grandfather, couldn't bring himself to do it. He spent his first few days clearing out the farmhouse, making it habitable. He found old furniture covered in dust sheets, boxes of forgotten belongings, and a collection of his grandfather's journals, filled with meticulous notes about the farm, the weather, and the barn. As he read through the journals, he began to understand his mother's concerns. Silas had written extensively about the barn, about the strange sounds he'd heard, the shadows he'd seen, the feeling of being watched. He described a presence, a guardian of the barn, something ancient and powerful, something that did not welcome intruders. Daniel dismissed it as the ramblings of an old man, the product of loneliness and an overactive imagination. He was a practical man, a man of logic and reason. He didn't believe in ghosts or spirits or ancient guardians. But then he entered the barn. It was vast and cavernous, filled with the scent of hay, dust, and something else, something faintly metallic like old blood. The air was heavy, still, despite the wind howling outside. Sunlight filtered through cracks in the walls, illuminating swirling motes of dust. He saw rusted farm implements, broken tools, and stacks of rotting hay bales. He walked deeper into the barn, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He felt a prickle of unease, a sense of being watched, but he attributed it to the eerie atmosphere of the place. Then, he heard it, a whisper, so faint he almost missed it. It seemed to come from the rafters above, a soft, sibilant sound that formed his name. Daniel! He stopped, his heart pounding. He looked up, scanning the shadows, but saw nothing. He told himself it was the wind, playing tricks with his ears. But the whisper came again, closer this time, clearer. Daniel, leave! He started to wonder if his mother was right. Daniel swallowed hard, trying to ignore the growing knot of fear in his stomach. He told himself he was being ridiculous, that there was a rational explanation for everything. He continued his exploration of the barn, determined to find the old wooden chest his mother had mentioned. She said Silas had kept a prized possession inside, a pocket watch he'd promised to Daniel. He moved towards the back of the barn, where a pile of debris, broken planks, rusted metal, and tangled ropes lay scattered against the wall. He carefully picked his way through the mess, his eyes scanning the shadows. He heard the whisper again, louder now, more insistent. "Daniel, go! This is not your place." He spun around, searching for the source of the sound. He saw nothing, only the empty barn, the dust motes dancing in the faint light. But he felt a presence, a cold, watchful presence that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the barn. He pressed on, ignoring the whispers, his determination fueled by a mixture of fear and stubbornness. He reached the pile of debris and began to clear it away, his hands trembling slightly. Beneath a tangle of ropes and a broken wheelbarrow, he found a small wooden chest, its surface covered in dust and cobwebs. He recognized it instantly, remembering his grandfather showing it to him when he was a child. He knelt down and tried to open the chest, but the latch was rusted shut. He searched around for something to pry it open, his heart pounding in his chest. He found a rusty metal bar, lying half buried in the dirt. As he reached for the bar, he heard a new sound, a low, guttural growl, coming from the shadows near the entrance of the barn. He froze, his blood turning to ice. He slowly turned his head, his eyes straining to see through the gloom. He saw a shape, a dark, indistinct form, lurking near the doorway. It was tall and shadowy, with no discernible features, but he could feel its presence, its malevolent intent. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was the guardian his grandfather had written about, the presence that haunted the barn, the thing that wanted him to leave. He knew this was not the wind. Daniel scrambled to his feet, clutching the metal bar in his hand, his heart hammering against his ribs. He backed away slowly, his eyes fixed on the shadowy figure, his mind racing. He considered running, making a dash for the door, but he knew he wouldn't make it. The figure was too close, and the barn felt different now, as if the space itself were constricting, trapping him. He raised the metal bar, a pathetic weapon against whatever this thing was, but his only defense. "Who are you?" he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "What do you want?" The figure didn't answer. It just stood there, silent and menacing, its presence filling the barn, suffocating him. He could hear the whispers again, swirling around him, a chorus of voices murmuring his name, urging him to leave, to surrender. Then he remembered the chest, his grandfather's watch. It was the only reason he was here. He couldn't leave without it. He glanced down at the chest, then back at the figure. He knew he had to act quickly. He took a deep breath, steeling his nerves, and lunged towards the chest, swinging the metal bar at the latch. The bar connected with a loud clang, and the latch shattered. He threw open the lid of the chest, his hands shaking so violently he could barely grasp the contents. Inside, nestled in a bed of faded velvet, was the watch, a beautiful, antique gold pocket watch, its surface intricately engraved. He grabbed it, clutching it tightly in his fist. As he did so, the shadowy figure moved, gliding towards him with unnatural speed. He cried out, a wordless shout of terror, and scrambled backwards, away from the approaching darkness. He tripped over a loose board and fell, sprawling on the dusty floor. The metal bar clattered away out of reach. He looked up, his eyes wide with fear, as the figure loomed over him, its formless shape blotting out the faint light. He closed his eyes, bracing himself for the inevitable, waiting for the cold embrace of the darkness. But it didn't come. Instead, he heard a new sound, a faint, rhythmic ticking, coming from the watch in his hand. It was a slow, steady sound, a comforting sound, a sound that seemed to push back the darkness, to hold the figure at bay. He opened his eyes, his gaze fixed on the watch. The hands were moving, slowly but surely, ticking away the seconds. He realized that the watch was more than just a timepiece. It was a link to his grandfather, a symbol of his love, a source of strength, and it was protecting him. The figure hesitated, its form flickering slightly, as if struggling against an unseen force. The whispers intensified, but they were no longer threatening, no longer urging him to leave. They were pleading. Daniel slowly got to his feet, still clutching the watch, his eyes fixed on the shadowy figure. He didn't understand what was happening, but he knew he had to get out of the barn to escape the oppressive presence that filled it. He backed away slowly, step by step, keeping the watch held out in front of him like a talisman. The figure remained where it was, watching him, its formless shape shifting and swirling in the shadows. He reached the doorway, the faint light of the outside world beckoning him. He turned and ran, not looking back, not stopping until he was far away from the barn, from the whispers, from the darkness that dwelled within. He clutched the watch and made it to his car. Daniel stumbled out of the barn, gasping for breath, his heart pounding like a drum against his ribs. He didn't stop running until he reached the relative safety of the farmhouse, slamming the door shut behind him and locking it, even though he knew it wouldn't keep out whatever lurked in the barn. He leaned against the door, his body trembling, his mind reeling from what he had just experienced. He looked down at the pocket watch in his hand, its golden surface gleaming faintly in the dim light. The ticking sound was steady, reassuring, a tiny beacon of normalcy in the midst of the surrounding chaos. He realized he had to leave Windrow Farm, to get as far away from the barn and its malevolent guardian as possible. But he also knew he couldn't just abandon his grandfather's legacy, his family history. He had to understand what was happening, why the barn was haunted, why the watch seemed to offer protection. He spent the rest of the evening poring over his grandfather's journals, searching for clues, for answers. He found more detailed accounts of Silas's encounters with the barn's presence, his growing fear, his desperate attempts to understand it. He discovered that the barn had not always been haunted. Silas had written about its construction, about the joy he'd felt working alongside his own father, building a structure that would serve the farm for generations to come. But then, something had changed. Silas had begun to notice strange occurrences, tools disappearing, animals acting strangely, whispers in the night. He'd initially dismissed them as his imagination, but the incidents had grown more frequent, more disturbing. He'd started researching the history of the land, delving into local folklore, searching for any explanation for what was happening. He discovered that the farm had been built on the site of an ancient burial ground, a place of power, a place where the veil between the living and the dead was thin. Silas had believed that the construction of the barn had disturbed something, awakened a dormant entity, a spirit tied to the land, a guardian of the burial ground. And he'd spent the rest of his life trying to appease it, to protect his family from its wrath. The watch, he wrote, was important. Daniel read on, his eyes scanning the pages, his heart pounding in his chest. He realized that his grandfather hadn't just been a simple farmer. He'd been a protector, a guardian of a secret, a keeper of a dangerous truth. And now, that responsibility had fallen to him. He had to find a way to deal with the presence in the barn, to put it to rest, to protect himself and anyone else who might come to Windrow Farm. He owed it to his grandfather, to his family, to the land itself. He closed the journal, his mind racing. He knew he couldn't do this alone. He needed help, someone who understood the supernatural, someone who could guide him, someone who wouldn't dismiss him as crazy. He looked at the watch again, turning it over in his hands. The ticking sound seemed to grow louder, more insistent, as if urging him on, guiding him towards a solution. He decided he would contact a paranormal specialist he saw on TV. He had a plan. Daniel spent the next few days researching paranormal investigators, poring over websites, reading reviews, trying to find someone credible, someone he could trust. It was a strange and unsettling experience, delving into a world he had always dismissed as fantasy. But the events in the barn had shattered his skepticism, forcing him to confront a reality he could no longer ignore. Finally, he found someone who seemed promising, a woman named Sarah Walker, who described herself as a sensitive and a medium, with experience in investigating haunted locations. She had a website filled with testimonials and case studies, and she seemed genuinely interested in helping people, not just in making money. He contacted her, sending a detailed email outlining his situation, his grandfather's journals, and the events in the barn. He hesitated before hitting send, feeling a mixture of hope and apprehension. He was putting his trust in a stranger, revealing a secret he had barely admitted to himself. To his surprise, Sarah responded almost immediately. She expressed a keen interest in his case, saying it resonated with some of her own experiences. She agreed to come to Windrow Farm the following week, bringing with her some equipment and a colleague, a man named Mark, who specialized in historical research. Daniel felt a surge of relief, mixed with a renewed sense of dread. He was finally taking action, but he knew that confronting the presence in the barn would be dangerous, potentially life-threatening. He spent the days leading up to Sarah's arrival preparing the farmhouse, gathering information, and trying to steel his nerves. He avoided the barn, staying as far away from it as possible, but he could still feel its presence, a constant, unsettling weight on his mind. He reread his grandfather's journals, focusing on the passages about the watch. Silas had described it as a key.
A conduit à protecteur.
He'd written about rituals he'd performed, using the watch as a focal point to appease the entity in the barn, to keep it contained. Daniel examined the watch closely, turning it over in his hands, searching for any hidden markings, any clue to its true purpose. He found nothing, but he felt a strange connection to the object, a sense of warmth, of reassurance, whenever he held it. Finally, the day arrived. Sarah and Mark arrived in a battered van, filled with equipment, cameras, sensors, recording devices, and a variety of strange-looking tools that Daniel couldn't identify. Sarah was a tall, slender woman with intense blue eyes and a calm, reassuring demeanor. Mark was a shorter, stockier man, with a scholarly air and a quiet, observant manner. They listened intently as Daniel recounted his story, his voice trembling slightly as he described the shadowy figure, the whispers, the ticking watch. Sarah nodded, her expression serious but not judgmental. "We've dealt with similar cases before," she said. "Entities tied to the land, guardians of sacred spaces. They can be powerful, but they can also be reasoned with." Mark, who had been examining Silas's journals, looked up, his brow furrowed. "This is fascinating," he said. "Your grandfather was remarkably thorough in his research. He identified the burial ground, the rituals, the entity's name." "Its name?" Daniel asked, surprised. Mark pointed to a passage in the journal, a scrawled entry near the end. "Silas calls it Corvin, the Watcher in the Dark." A chill ran down Daniel's spine. The name, spoken aloud, seemed to resonate with the very air of the farmhouse, to awaken something ancient and malevolent. They decided to proceed with caution. Sarah explained that their first step would be to assess the energy in the barn, to try to communicate with Corvin, to understand its intentions. She warned Daniel that it could be dangerous, that the entity might react aggressively. Daniel hesitated, his fear returning, but he knew he couldn't back down now. He had to face Corvin to protect his family's legacy, to find peace for himself and for the restless spirit that haunted Windrow Farm. He was ready. The sanitarium's echo. Sergeant Rebecca Beck Lawson, a recently retired police detective, found herself drawn back to a place she'd hoped never to see again, the Blackwood Sanitarium. It wasn't a case that brought her there, not officially, but a persistent, nagging unease, a sense of unfinished business that had haunted her since her last visit to the sprawling, abandoned institution years ago. Blackwood had been a notorious mental asylum, a place of whispered horrors and unexplained disappearances. It had closed down decades ago, officially due to budget cuts, but rumors persisted of inhumane treatments, neglected patients, and a lingering darkness that clung to the decaying walls. Beck had been part of a small team that had investigated the sanitarium after its closure, searching for evidence of wrongdoing, for answers to the unsettling stories. They had found nothing concrete, no definitive proof of abuse, no explanation for the pervasive sense of dread that permeated the place. But Beck had felt something. She'd heard whispers, seen shadows, experienced a bone-chilling cold that defied the summer heat. She'd dismissed it as her imagination, the product of the eerie atmosphere and the disturbing history of the place. But the feeling had never truly left her, a persistent itch in the back of her mind. Now, retired and restless, she decided to return, alone this time, armed with nothing but a flashlight, a notepad, and a stubborn determination to find some answers, some closure. She arrived on a gray, overcast afternoon. The sanitarium loomed before her, a hulking mass of crumbling brick and broken windows, surrounded by overgrown weeds and twisted trees. The air was heavy with the scent of decay and damp earth. She pushed open the rusted iron gates, the screeching sound echoing in the silence. She walked slowly up the overgrown driveway, her boots crunching on gravel and broken glass. The front doors were boarded up, but she found a side entrance that was partially open, a broken window offering easy access. She climbed through the window, her heart pounding in her chest. The interior was dim and dusty, lit only by the faint light filtering through the grimy windows. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. She switched on her flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom, revealing peeling paint, crumbling plaster, and scattered debris. She found herself in a long corridor, lined with doors that had once led to patients' rooms. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional creak of the building and the faint rustling of unseen creatures. She felt a chill, despite her thick jacket, a sense of being watched, of not being alone. She began to explore, her footsteps echoing in the empty halls. She checked each room, finding them mostly empty, stripped bare of any furniture or personal belongings. Some rooms still had rusted bed frames, overturned chairs, or stained mattresses, remnants of the lives that had once been lived within these walls. She heard a faint sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping, coming from somewhere down the corridor. She froze, listening intently. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, like a metronome keeping time in the silence. She slowly began walking in the direction of the sound, her flashlight held out in front of her. Beck followed the tapping sound, her senses on high alert. The corridor twisted and turned, leading her deeper into the heart of the sanitarium. The air grew colder, and the smell of decay intensified. She felt a growing sense of dread, a premonition of something terrible waiting for her. The tapping led her to a large ward room, its walls lined with rows of empty beds. The windows were covered in grime, casting the room in a perpetual twilight. In the center of the room, she saw a single, overturned wheelchair, its wheels spinning slowly, as if someone had just pushed it. The tapping was louder here, emanating from the far corner of the room. Beck approached cautiously, her flashlight beam dancing across the floor, revealing scattered debris, broken glass, rusted medical instruments, and tattered pieces of clothing. She reached the corner and found the source of the sound. It was a small metal pipe, hanging loose from the ceiling, dripping water onto a metal tray on the floor. The rhythmic dripping created the tapping sound, a perfectly natural explanation. Beck let out a sigh of relief, her tension easing slightly. She felt foolish for letting her imagination run wild, for allowing the atmosphere of the place to get to her. It was just a dripping pipe. But as she turned to leave, she heard something else, a faint whisper, so soft she almost missed it. It seemed to come from the air around her, a breathy, indistinct murmur that formed her name. Rebecca! She froze, her blood turning to ice. She spun around, her flashlight beam sweeping across the room, searching for the source of the whisper. There was nothing there, only the empty beds, the overturned wheelchair, the dripping pipe. She told herself it was the wind, the echo of her own name, a trick of her ears. But she knew deep down that it was something more. She was not alone in this place. She decided to explore further, her fear battling with her determination to find answers. She moved through the sanitarium, checking more rooms, finding more signs of decay and neglect, but nothing that explained the whispers, the tapping, the pervasive sense of dread. She came to a large central room that had once been the sanitarium's common area. There were a few broken chairs, a tattered rug, and a large, empty fireplace, On the wall above the fireplace, she saw a faded mural depicting a pastoral scene: rolling hills, green trees, a clear blue sky. It was a jarring contrast to the grim reality of the sanitarium, a reminder of a world that no longer existed, at least not within these walls. As she stood there, gazing at the mural, she heard the whispers again, louder this time, more distinct. They seemed to be coming from the fireplace, from the darkness within the chimney. She cautiously approached, her flashlight beam illuminating the soot-stained bricks. She leaned in, peering into the darkness, trying to see if anything was hidden there. And then she saw it. Two eyes were staring at her. Beck recoiled, stumbling backward, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. The eyes, glowing faintly in the darkness of the fireplace, were not human. They were too large, too round, too empty. They seemed to stare straight through her, seeing not her physical form, but something deeper, something hidden within her soul. She raised her flashlight, shining the beam directly into the fireplace. The eyes vanished. There was nothing there, only soot and ashes and the faint smell of burnt wood. She stood there for a long moment, trembling, her mind racing. She tried to rationalize what she had seen, to convince herself it was a reflection, a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by fear and exhaustion. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she had seen something real, something that should not exist. She backed away from the fireplace, her eyes fixed on the darkness within. She felt a cold dread creep over her, a sense of being watched, of being hunted. She knew she had to leave, to get out of the sanitarium before it was too late. She turned and ran, not caring about the noise she made, her boots pounding on the floor, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly off the walls. She ran through the corridors, past the empty rooms, past the shadows that seemed to reach out for her. She heard the whispers again, chasing her, swirling around her, calling her name, urging her to stay, to join them in the darkness. She ignored them, focusing on her escape, on the faint glimmer of light that marked the entrance. She reached the broken window and scrambled through, cutting her hand on a shard of glass, but barely feeling the pain. She ran across the overgrown driveway, through the rusted gates, and out onto the road, not stopping until she was far away from the sanitarium, from the darkness that dwelled within. She stood there, gasping for breath, her body shaking, her mind reeling. She looked back at the sanitarium, silhouetted against the twilight sky, its broken windows like empty eyes staring out at her. She knew she would never forget what she had seen, what she had heard, what she had felt in that place. She had found no answers, no closure, only more questions, more fear. The Blackwood Sanitarium remained a mystery, a place of shadows and whispers, a place where the past refused to stay buried. And Beck, the retired detective, knew that a part of her would always remain trapped within its walls, haunted by the memory of those glowing eyes in the darkness. She knew she should tell someone, but who would believe her? The shadow collector, Henry, a photographer with a passion for the unusual and the macabre, heard rumors of an abandoned mansion on the outskirts of town, a place said to be haunted by shadows. Not ghosts, not spirits, but actual physical shadows, detached from any object or person, that moved and shifted and collected. Intrigued, and always seeking inspiration for his dark, atmospheric photography, Henry decided to investigate. He arrived at the mansion on a moonless night. The building was a Victorian-era monstrosity, with crumbling walls, boarded-up windows, and a roof that sagged precariously. The grounds were overgrown, with tangled vines and thorny bushes obscuring the path to the front door. The air was still and heavy, carrying a faint scent of decay and damp earth. He carried only his camera, a powerful flash unit, and a tripod. He wasn't interested in capturing evidence of the paranormal. He wanted to capture the feeling of the place, the atmosphere of dread, the play of light and shadow. He wanted to see if the rumors were true, if these shadows actually existed. He forced open the front door, the wood groaning in protest. The interior was pitch black, the air thick with dust and the smell of mildew. He switched on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, revealing a grand entrance hall, stripped bare of any furniture, the walls covered in peeling wallpaper and cobwebs. He set up his tripod and camera, aiming it down the hallway. He took a test shot, the flash illuminating the space for a brief, blinding moment. He checked the camera's display screen. The photo showed the hallway, empty and decaying as he expected. But there was something else, something subtle at the edge of the frame, a darkness that was deeper than the surrounding shadows, a shape that seemed to have no source. He took another shot, aiming the camera at a different angle. Again, the flash illuminated the hallway, and again, the photo revealed a strange, indistinct shadow lurking in a corner near a broken mirror. Intrigued, Henry moved deeper into the mansion, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He explored the rooms one by one, taking photos with the flash, capturing the decay, the emptiness, and the increasingly unsettling shadows. The shadows were always there, in the periphery of the images, never directly in front of the camera, always lurking at the edges, in the corners, behind objects. They seemed to be avoiding the direct light, but they were undeniably present, growing bolder, more distinct with each photograph. He entered a large drawing room, its windows covered in thick, black curtains. The air in this room was particularly heavy, and the smell of decay was stronger. He set up his tripod in the center of the room and took a series of photos, rotating the camera to capture the entire space. As he reviewed the images, he felt a chill run down his spine. The photos showed the room filled with shadows, not just in the corners, but everywhere, on the walls, on the ceiling, on the floor. They were swirling, merging, forming shapes that resembled human figures, but distorted, elongated, grotesque. And they were moving. In one photo, a shadow was near the fireplace. In the next, it was closer to the center of the room. In the third, it was right behind where he was standing. He quickly turned around, shining his flashlight into the darkness. There was nothing there, but he could feel it, a cold presence, a sense of being watched, of being surrounded. The shadows, while still there, were no longer in the photos. Henry felt a surge of panic, a primal fear that threatened to overwhelm him. He wanted to run, to escape the suffocating darkness of the drawing room, but he forced himself to stay calm, to think. He was a photographer, an observer. He had to document this to understand what was happening. He decided to try a different approach. He turned off his flashlight, plunging the room into complete darkness. He raised his camera, set the flash to its highest setting, and took a picture. The flash illuminated the room for a blinding instant, and in that brief moment, Henry saw them. They were not just shadows. They were things, entities of pure darkness, with no discernible features, no eyes, no mouths, just formless, shifting shapes that seemed to absorb all light. They were all around him, filling the room, reaching out for him, their movements swift and silent. He lowered the camera, his hands shaking, his heart pounding in his chest. He was surrounded by darkness again, but he knew they were still there, waiting, watching. He checked the photo on the camera's display screen. It was a blur of white light and distorted shadows, but he could make out the shapes, the outlines of the entities, their presence captured in the fleeting moment of the flash. He had his proof. The rumors were true. The mansion was a collector of shadows, a place where darkness had taken on a life of its own. He felt a cold touch on his arm, a sensation like a wisp of icy air. He flinched, dropping his camera. It clattered on the floor, the sound echoing in the silence. He scrambled to pick it up, his fingers fumbling in the darkness. He found it, grabbed it, and raised it again, pointing it blindly into the room. He pressed the shutter button, firing the flash. The flash revealed the entities again, closer now, almost within arm's reach. They were swirling around him, their forms shifting and changing, their darkness growing more intense. He took another photo, and another, each flash capturing the terrifying reality of the shadows, their relentless approach. He was documenting his own demise, capturing the moments before he was consumed by the darkness. He felt a pressure on his chest, a suffocating weight that made it difficult to breathe. He gasped for air, his lungs burning. He knew he had to get out, to escape the room, to escape the mansion. The entities were getting closer with every picture. Henry stumbled backward, away from the swirling shadows, his camera clutched tightly in his hand. He tripped over something on the floor, a broken chair, a pile of debris he didn't know, and fell, sprawling on his back. The shadows loomed over him, their darkness pressing down on him, suffocating him. He raised his camera one last time, a desperate, reflexive act, and fired the flash. The burst of light illuminated the room, revealing the full horror of the entities. They were no longer just formless shadows. They had taken on a semblance of shape, of structure. He saw skeletal limbs, gaping maws, and hollow eyes that seemed to burn with a cold, dark fire. He screamed, a wordless cry of terror, and then nothing. The camera fell from his hand, landing on the floor with a dull thud. The flash had gone out, leaving the room in complete darkness once more. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic pulsing of the shadows, a sound like the beating of a monstrous, unseen heart. The next morning, a group of teenagers, drawn by the rumors of the haunted mansion, ventured inside. They found the drawing room, empty except for the dust, the debris, and a single, expensive camera lying on the floor. They picked up the camera, curious, and began to scroll through the images. They saw the photos of the decaying mansion, the empty rooms, the peeling wallpaper. They saw the increasingly unsettling images of the shadows, growing bolder, more distinct, with each shot. And then, they saw the final photos, the ones taken in the darkness, the ones that showed the entities in their full, terrifying form. They saw the skeletal limbs, the gaping maws, the hollow eyes. They saw the photographer's terror, frozen in the fleeting moment of the flash. They stared at the images, their faces pale, their hearts pounding. They understood, without a doubt, that the rumors were true. The mansion was haunted, not by ghosts, but by something far more sinister, something that collected shadows, and perhaps something more. They dropped the camera as if it were burning hot and fled the mansion, leaving the shadows to their darkness, leaving the photographer's final testament to the horrors he had witnessed. The camera lay on the floor, its battery dead, its memory full of images that would forever haunt their dreams. The mansion remained, waiting for its next victim. The final picture was of Henry. The whistle stopped to nowhere. Exhaustion gnawed at Thomas, a drifter who'd been walking for days, following the faded lines of disused railway tracks. He'd run out of money, out of options, and almost out of hope. As twilight deepened into a starless night, he stumbled upon an old, abandoned train station, a relic of a bygone era. It seemed like as good a place as any to rest his weary bones. The station, if it could even be called that anymore, was little more than a crumbling platform and a single, dilapidated waiting room. The wooden walls were warped and cracked, the paint long peeled away. The windows were either broken or boarded up, and the roof sagged ominously in places. The air hung heavy with the scent of dust, rust, and something vaguely metallic. Thomas pushed open the remains of a door, its hinges groaning in protest. The waiting room was small and empty, save for a few rickety benches and a pile of debris in one corner. A single, flickering oil lamp, hanging precariously from a rusty hook on the wall, cast a dim, unsteady light. He dropped his worn backpack onto a bench, feeling the weight of his weariness settle upon him. He was bone-tired, his muscles aching, his mind numb from days of walking and nights of fitful sleep. He just needed to rest, to close his eyes for a few hours, and then he'd move on, following the tracks to wherever they might lead. He sat down, leaning his head against the wall, trying to find a comfortable position. The silence of the station was unsettling, broken only by the creak of the old building and the occasional rustle of the wind. Then he heard it, the faint, distant whistle, the unmistakable sound of a steam train, echoing through the night. Thomas sat up, his heart pounding. He looked around, his eyes straining to see through the grimy windows. There were no trains. The tracks outside were rusted and overgrown with weeds. The station had been abandoned for years, decades even. He told himself it was his imagination, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and hunger. But then he heard it again, the whistle, closer this time, more distinct. And with it, he heard something else, a faint, rhythmic chugging sound, the unmistakable sound of a train approaching. He stood up, his legs trembling, and moved towards the door, peering out onto the platform. He saw nothing, only the empty tracks stretching into the darkness. But the sounds were growing louder, closer, more real. He felt a surge of fear, mixed with a strange sense of anticipation. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew he couldn't stay here. He had to get away, to put as much distance as possible between himself and that approaching train. He could feel it now. Thomas grabbed his backpack, slinging it over his shoulder. He was about to run, to flee the station and its approaching phantom train, when he heard something else of voices. They were faint at first, murmurs carried on the wind, but they grew steadily louder, clearer. They were whispering his name, calling to him, beckoning him to stay. "Thomas!" The voices whispered. "Thomas, wait!" He hesitated, his hand on the door frame, his mind reeling. He didn't recognize the voices, but they seemed to know him, to be waiting for him. He felt a strange pull, a compulsion to stay, to see what was coming. The train whistle blew again, closer now, almost deafening. He could feel the ground vibrating beneath his feet, the air thrumming with the approach of something massive, something powerful. He stepped out onto the platform, his eyes fixed on the tracks. He still saw nothing, but he could hear the train now, the chugging of its engine, the screech of its wheels, the hiss of its steam. It was close, very close. And then he saw them, shadows moving along the tracks, flickering in and out of existence. They were human-shaped, but indistinct, their forms shifting and swirling like smoke. They were running towards the station, their arms outstretched, their voices whispering his name. "Thomas, come with us," they whispered. "Thomas, it's time." He felt a wave of terror wash over him, a primal fear that threatened to paralyze him. He wanted to run, to scream, but he was frozen in place, his eyes fixed on the approaching shadows, his ears filled with the deafening roar of the unseen train. He felt a cold touch on his hand, and he looked down. A shadowy figure stood beside him, its form indistinct, its face a blank void. It reached out, its long, thin fingers wrapping around his wrist. "All aboard, Thomas," the figure whispered, its voice a chilling rasp. "All aboard." He tried to pull away, to resist, but the figure's grip was surprisingly strong. He felt himself being pulled towards the tracks, towards the oncoming train, towards the darkness that awaited him. The other figures were starting to surround him. Thomas struggled, his mind screaming in protest, but his body felt weak, his movements sluggish. The shadowy figures were all around him now, their whispers merging into a chorus of voices, urging him to join them, to board the train, to embrace the darkness. He felt a sense of unreality, as if he were trapped in a nightmare, a dream from which he couldn't awaken. He looked down at the tracks, expecting to see the gleaming metal of the rails, the wooden ties, the gravel ballast. But there was nothing there. The tracks had vanished, replaced by a swirling void, a bottomless abyss that seemed to stretch into infinity. The train was no longer a physical object, but a presence, a force, a wave of darkness that was rushing towards him, threatening to engulf him. He closed his eyes, bracing himself for the impact, for the oblivion that awaited him. He felt a strange sense of peace, a surrender to the inevitable. He was tired of running, tired of struggling, tired of being alone. He heard the train whistle one last time, a deafening blast that seemed to tear through his very soul. He felt the cold touch of the shadows on his skin, their whispers merging into a single unified voice. "Welcome home, Thomas," the voice said, and then there was only silence. The next morning, a hiker, passing by the old, abandoned train station, noticed the door hanging open. He cautiously entered, curious to see what was inside. He found nothing but an empty waiting room, dusty benches, and a pile of debris in one corner. A single, flickering oil lamp cast a dim, unsteady light. He saw a worn backpack lying on one of the benches, as if someone had left it behind in a hurry. He called out, but there was no answer. The station was deserted, abandoned, a relic of a bygone era. He shrugged, assuming the owner of the backpack would eventually return. He left the station, continuing on his hike, unaware of the darkness that lurked within, of the phantom train that ran on tracks of shadow, of the passengers it carried to a destination unknown. The station remained, waiting, the whispering wardrobe. Olivia, a young woman living alone in a cramped city apartment, had always been a creature of habit and order. Her small space was meticulously organized, every object in its designated place, every surface clean and uncluttered. She found comfort in routine, in the predictability of her daily life. But her carefully constructed world was disrupted by a seemingly innocuous event, the persistent opening of her living room closet door. It was a small closet built into the wall, where she stored coats, jackets, and a few boxes of old photographs and keepsakes. She always made sure to close the door firmly, hearing the click of the latch as it engaged. Yet repeatedly, she would wake up in the middle of the night to find it ajar, a dark, gaping maw in the otherwise tidy room. At first, she dismissed it as a minor annoyance, a quirk of the old building. She checked the hinges, the latch, the door frame. Everything seemed normal. She tried wedging a chair under the doorknob, but the next morning, the chair would be pushed aside, the door slightly open. She started to feel uneasy, a prickle of anxiety that she couldn't quite shake. It wasn't just the door opening. It was the feeling that accompanied it, a sense of being watched, of a presence lurking in the darkness of the closet. And then, she started to hear the whispers. They were faint at first, barely audible above the hum of the refrigerator and the distant traffic noise. But they grew steadily louder, more persistent, filling the silence of her apartment with a constant, murmuring undercurrent. She couldn't make out any words, any distinct voices. It was just a jumble of sounds, a susurrus of whispers that seemed to come from the closet itself, from the darkness behind her clothes. She began to dread going to bed, to lie awake in the darkness, listening to the whispers, feeling the cold gaze of the unseen presence in the closet. Her sleep became fragmented, filled with unsettling dreams of dark shapes and muffled voices. She tried everything she could think of to stop the door from opening. She replaced the latch, reinforced the frame, even nailed the door shut. But nothing worked. The door would always, somehow, find a way to open, just a crack, just enough to let the whispers out, to let the darkness seep into her room. She could not explain what was going on. Olivia's carefully ordered world began to unravel. She became withdrawn, irritable, her concentration shattered. She made mistakes at work, forgot appointments, neglected her appearance. The whispers, the constant feeling of being watched, were consuming her, driving her to the edge of madness. She tried to talk to her friends about it, but they dismissed her concerns, attributing it to stress, to lack of sleep, to an overactive imagination. They told her to relax, to see a doctor, to get some rest. But she knew it was more than that. She knew there was something in the closet, something that was watching her, something that was whispering to her in the darkness. One night, she reached her breaking point. She woke up to find the closet door wide open, the darkness within seeming to pulse, to breathe. The whispers were louder than ever, a cacophony of voices that filled her head, making her skull ache. She couldn't take it anymore. She had to confront whatever was in the closet, to face her fear, to find out what it wanted. She got out of bed, her legs trembling, her heart pounding in her chest. She walked slowly towards the closet, her eyes fixed on the darkness within. She reached out and grabbed the edge of the door, her fingers brushing against the cold wood. She took a deep breath, steeling her nerves, and pulled the door open wider. The closet was empty. There were her coats, her jackets, her boxes of old photographs. There was nothing else. No hidden compartment, no secret passage, no lurking figure. Just the bare wooden walls, the dusty floor, the faint scent of mothballs. She felt a wave of relief, followed by a surge of anger. She had been tormenting herself for weeks, driven to the brink of madness by nothing. It was all in her head, a product of her own anxieties, her own fears. She slammed the closet door shut, the sound echoing in the silent apartment. She leaned against the door, her body shaking, her mind racing. And then she heard it, the whispers. They were coming from inside the closet, muffled by the closed door, but still there, still persistent, still calling to her. She realized that the closet was not the source of the presence. It was merely a gateway, a conduit. The thing, whatever it was somewhere else, somewhere beyond her comprehension, and it was using the closet to reach her, to communicate with her, to watch her. She felt a cold dread settle over her, a sense of hopelessness, of despair. She was trapped, not by physical walls, but by something far more insidious, something that existed just beyond the realm of her understanding. She had to find some way to close the door. Olivia, despite her mounting terror, refused to be completely defeated. She understood now that she wasn't dealing with a physical entity, something she could fight or trap. She was dealing with something else, something that existed on a different plane, something that used the closet as a point of contact. She started researching, spending hours online, delving into obscure forums, reading about paranormal phenomena, about portals, about interdimensional beings. She knew it sounded crazy, but she had to explore every possibility, no matter how far-fetched. She stumbled upon accounts of similar experiences, of people who had encountered unexplained whispers, unseen presences, objects that moved on their own. She read about rituals, about protective symbols, about ways to sever connections with the other side. She decided to try a cleansing ritual, a simple ceremony she found described in an old book on folklore. It involved burning sage, reciting specific incantations, and visualizing a barrier of white light surrounding her apartment. She gathered the necessary materials, a bundle of dried sage, a white candle, and a small bowl of salt. She waited until nightfall, until the whispers from the closet were at their loudest. She lit the candle, the flame flickering in the darkness. She held the sage bundle and lit the end, letting the fragrant smoke fill the room. She walked around the apartment, waving the smoking sage, reciting the incantations, her voice trembling at first, but growing stronger with each repetition. She focused on the closet, visualizing a wall of white light forming around it, sealing it off, blocking the connection to whatever lurked beyond. She sprinkled salt along the threshold, creating a physical barrier. When she was finished, she felt different. The air in the apartment seemed lighter, the oppressive atmosphere diminished. The whispers from the closet were still there, but they were fainter, more distant. She went to bed, exhausted but hopeful. She slept soundly, for the first time in weeks, undisturbed by nightmares or the feeling of being watched. The next morning, she woke up to find the closet door closed. She cautiously approached it, listening. The whispers were gone. The smell of old flowers was gone. She opened the door. The closet was empty, just as it should be. She felt a surge of relief, a sense of victory. She had done it. She had broken the connection, sealed the gateway, banished the unseen presence. But as the days turned into weeks, a nagging doubt began to creep into her mind. The closet door remained closed. The whispers remained silent. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't solved the problem, that she had merely suppressed it. She started to notice other things, subtle changes in her apartment. Objects would be slightly out of place. Books would fall from shelves. The temperature would fluctuate for no apparent reason. She would hear faint sounds, creaks, taps, rustlings that she couldn't explain. She began to wonder if the presence had simply moved, shifted its focus, found another way to manifest itself. She felt like she was living in a state of constant vigilance, always on edge, always waiting for the next sign, the next disturbance. The quiet was starting to get to her. One evening, Olivia was sitting in her living room, reading a book, trying to distract herself from the growing unease she felt. The apartment was quiet, the lights were on, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She looked up, her eyes drawn to the wall opposite the closet. There was nothing there, just a blank expanse of white plaster. But as she stared at it, she noticed something odd. A faint shadow, a subtle darkening of the wall, began to appear. It was shapeless at first, just a smudge of gray against the white, but it gradually grew more distinct, more defined. It began to take on a form, a shape, a silhouette. It resembled a doorway, a rectangular outline that seemed to shimmer and waver in the air. Olivia's heart pounded in her chest. She knew with a chilling certainty what was happening. The presence, the entity from the closet, had found another way in. It was no longer confined to the closet. It was expanding its reach, claiming more of her space. She watched in horror as the shadow doorway grew darker, more solid, as if it were becoming a real, physical opening. She could feel a cold draft emanating from it, a sense of emptiness, a void. She heard the whispers again, faint at first, but growing louder, closer. They were coming from the shadow doorway, from the darkness beyond. She knew she couldn't stay, she couldn't fight this. It was too powerful, too pervasive. She had to leave, to escape the apartment before it was too late. She grabbed her purse, her keys, and her phone. She ran to the front door, fumbling with the lock, her hands shaking. As she opened the door, she glanced back at the living room. The shadow doorway was now fully formed, a gaping hole in the wall, a portal to some unknown dimension. And from within the darkness, she saw something emerging. It was a hand, a long, thin hand with skeletal fingers, reaching out for her. Olivia screamed and fled the apartment, slamming the door shut behind her. She ran down the stairs, out into the street, not stopping until she was far away from the building, from the whispering closet, from the shadow doorway. She never went back. She abandoned her belongings, her apartment, her life in that city. She moved far away, starting over, trying to forget what she had experienced. But she knew, deep down, that she could never truly escape. The presence, the entity, the shadows, they were no longer confined to a single closet, to a single apartment. They were out there somewhere waiting, watching, whispering. And she knew that one day they would find her again. She was always looking over her shoulder, the gaze of glass. Arthur, a retired professor of art history, had a particular fondness for antique mirrors. He believed they held a certain mystique, a reflection of not just the present, but also the past, capturing fleeting moments and emotions within their depths. His modest apartment was adorned with several such mirrors, each with its own unique history and character. But one particular acquisition, a large Venetian mirror with an elaborately carved wooden frame, would soon disrupt Arthur's quiet, scholarly life. He found the mirror at a small, dusty antique shop tucked away on a side street. It was leaning against a wall, partially obscured by a pile of old furniture. He was immediately drawn to it, to the intricate detail of the carvings, to the way the glass seemed to shimmer even in the dim light of the shop. The shop owner, a wizened old man with a knowing smile, told him the mirror was a rare find, a genuine 18th century Venetian piece, with a history as rich and complex as its craftsmanship. He also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the mirror was said to be temperamental, that it didn't always reflect things accurately. Arthur dismissed this as folklore, the kind of embellishment often attached to antiques to enhance their value. He was a man of reason, of logic, not prone to superstition. He purchased the mirror, carefully transported it to his apartment, and hung it on the living room wall, where it quickly became the focal point of the room. First, everything seemed normal. The mirror reflected his apartment, his furniture, his own image with perfect clarity. He admired its craftsmanship. The way the carved wooden faces on the frame seemed to watch him with their silent, enigmatic expressions. But then he started to notice discrepancies. It began subtly. He would glance at the mirror and see his reflection, but his expression would be slightly off. A fleeting smile when he was frowning, a furrowed brow when he was feeling relaxed, a momentary flicker of something he couldn't quite define. He attributed it to tricks of the light, to his own tired eyes, to the imperfections in the old glass. But the discrepancies grew more frequent, more noticeable. He would see his reflection move when he was standing still, its mouth opening and closing as if speaking silent words, its eyes shifting to look at things that weren't there. He would see objects in the reflection that were not present in the room, a vase of flowers on a table that didn't exist, a painting on the wall that he didn't own. He began to feel uneasy, a growing sense of dread that he couldn't quite shake. He started to avoid looking at the mirror, averting his gaze whenever he passed it, but he could still feel its presence, its cold, watchful gaze. He started having odd dreams. Arthur's nights became filled with disturbing dreams, vivid and unsettling visions that seemed to be connected to the mirror. He would see himself standing in front of it, but his reflection would be distorted, grotesque, its features twisted into a mask of horror. He would hear whispers, coming from the mirror, speaking in a language he didn't understand, yet somehow felt deep within his bones. He would wake up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding, his mind racing. He tried to dismiss the dreams as mere nightmares, the product of his anxieties and his overactive imagination. But they felt too real, too connected to the strange occurrences he was experiencing during the day. He decided to research the mirror's history, hoping to find some explanation for its unsettling behavior. He spent hours in libraries, poring over old books and documents, searching for any mention of the mirror, of its maker, of its previous owners. He discovered that the mirror had a long and troubled past, a history filled with stories of misfortune, of madness, of unexplained deaths. It had passed through many hands, each owner experiencing strange phenomena, each eventually parting with the mirror under mysterious circumstances. One account from a 19th century diary described the mirror as a window to another world, a portal through which unseen entities could enter our realm. The diary's author wrote of seeing his own reflection speak to him, of hearing voices from the glass, of feeling a cold presence emanating from the mirror. He had eventually smashed the mirror in a fit of terror, but the fragments had mysteriously reassembled themselves overnight. Arthur felt a chill run down his spine as he read these words. He was experiencing the same phenomena, the same unsettling feeling of being watched, of being manipulated by something beyond his comprehension. He returned to his apartment, his mind racing. He stood in front of the mirror, staring at his reflection, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and fascination. He saw his reflection smile, a slow, chilling smile that did not match his own expression. He saw its eyes flicker, shifting their gaze to something behind him, something he couldn't see. He heard a whisper, faint but clear, coming from the mirror. It said his name, Arthur. He felt a cold breath on his neck, and he spun around, expecting to see someone standing behind him. But there was nothing there, only the empty room, the silent furniture, the watchful gaze of the carved faces on the mirror frame. He knew he had to get rid of the mirror to break the connection, to escape its influence. But he also knew, with a growing sense of dread, that it wouldn't be easy. The mirror, it seemed, had a will of its own. It did not want to be discarded. Arthur tried to remove the mirror from the wall, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if it were fused to the plaster, held in place by some unseen force. He pulled with all his might, his muscles straining, his hands slipping on the smooth wood of the frame. The mirror remained firmly in place. He tried smashing the glass, hitting it with a hammer, but the hammer bounced off harmlessly, leaving not even a scratch on the surface. The mirror seemed indestructible, impervious to any physical force. He felt a growing sense of panic, of being trapped, of being at the mercy of something he couldn't understand, something he couldn't control. He decided to try a different approach. He remembered the diary entry, the one that described the mirror as a window to another world. He thought that perhaps, and he draped them over the mirror, covering it completely, blocking out all light. He secured the edges with tape, making sure no sliver of glass was visible. He stepped back, breathing heavily, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was now darker, the only light coming from the hallway. He waited, listening, watching. For a moment there was silence. He felt a flicker of hope, a sense of relief. Perhaps he had done it. Perhaps he had broken the connection. But then he heard it, a faint, muffled sound coming from behind the blankets. It was a scratching sound, like fingernails scraping against glass. He felt a cold dread creep over him. He knew what it meant. The mirror, or whatever was behind it, was trying to get out. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. The blankets began to bulge, to ripple, as if something were pushing against them from the other side. Arthur backed away, his eyes fixed on the covered mirror, his body trembling with fear. He knew he couldn't stay in the apartment, that he had to escape before whatever was behind the mirror broke free. He turned and ran, fleeing his apartment, leaving the mirror behind, shrouded in darkness, scratching, scraping, trying to reach him. He ran until he was far away from the building, from the street, from the city itself. He found refuge in a small, anonymous motel room, miles from his home. He sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands, his mind racing. He knew he could never go back to his apartment, that he could never face that mirror again. He had lost his home, his possessions, his life, all because of an antique mirror, a window to another world. But he was alive. He had escaped, and that, he realized, was all that mattered. He decided it was time to let go of the past. The Inn of Slumbering Shadows. Leo, a travel blogger known for seeking out obscure and offbeat destinations, stumbled upon a peculiar listing online. The still hollow and guaranteed the best sleep of your life. The accompanying description was sparse, mentioning only the inn's remote location, its unusually quiet atmosphere, and its proprietor's strict rule of no questions asked. Intrigued by the promise of restful sleep, something he'd struggled with for years, Leo booked a room. The directions led him far off the main highway, down a winding, unpaved road that snaked through a dense forest. The air grew noticeably colder as he drove, and a thick fog began to roll in, obscuring the surrounding trees. He felt a sense of isolation, of being cut off from the rest of the world. Finally, he saw it, the still hollow inn, a low, sprawling building constructed of dark, weathered wood. It looked more like a hunting lodge than a traditional inn, with a single dimly lit porch and heavy, wooden shutters covering the windows. There were no other buildings in sight, no signs of civilization, only the dense forest pressing in on all sides. He parked his car in front of the inn and stepped out, the silence immediately striking him. There was no wind, no birdsong, no rustling of leaves, only a profound, unsettling stillness. He approached the front door, a heavy, oak affair with a rusted iron knocker. He hesitated for a moment, feeling a prickle of unease, but then he knocked, the sound echoing loudly in the silence. The door creaked open, revealing a tall, gaunt man with hollow cheeks and deep-set eyes. He wore a dark, shapeless suit that seemed to absorb the light, making him appear almost two-dimensional. "You must be Leo," the man said, his voice a low, rasping whisper. "Come in." Leo stepped inside, finding himself in a dimly lit reception area. The air was heavy with the scent of dust and old wood. There was a small wooden counter, a few worn armchairs, and a large, stone fireplace that was cold and empty. The man, who introduced himself as Silas, the innkeeper, gestured towards a worn leather-bound register. "Sign here," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth or inflection. Leo signed his name, noticing that the previous entry was dated several months ago. He also noticed that Silas did not ask for any payment, any identification, or any information about his stay. He simply handed him a key, a heavy, iron thing with a number etched into it. 7. Your room, Silas said, pointing down a long, dark hallway.
No disturbances.
No questions. Leo nodded, feeling a growing sense of unease. He followed the hallway, his footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. The air grew colder with each step, and the silence seemed to press in on him, making it difficult to breathe. He found room 7, a small, sparsely furnished space with a single bed, a wooden chair, and a narrow window covered by heavy shutters. He tried to open the shutters, but they were locked, sealed shut. He sat down on the bed, feeling the thin mattress sag beneath his weight. He was tired, exhausted from the long drive, but he also felt a strange sense of restlessness, of anticipation. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about this place, about the silence, about the innkeeper's strange demeanor. He decided he would try and get some sleep. Leo lay down on the bed, pulling the thin blanket over him. He closed his eyes, trying to relax, to clear his mind, to drift off to sleep. But the silence of the room was oppressive, unnerving. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was an absence of sound, a void that seemed to press in on him, making his ears ring. He tossed and turned, unable to find a comfortable position. He felt a growing sense of anxiety, a feeling that he was being watched, that he was not alone in the room. Then he heard it, a faint sound, coming from above, from the ceiling. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone walking on tiptoe across the floor above. He sat up, his heart pounding. He looked around the room, but saw nothing. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate. He knew there was no one staying there but him, right? He got out of bed and pressed his ear against the ceiling, listening. The tapping stopped. He waited, holding his breath. Then it started again, this time closer, directly above his head. He felt a chill run down his spine. He knew there was no second floor to the inn. He had seen it from the outside, a single-story building with a low, sloping roof. There was nothing above his room but the attic, and the attic, Silas had said, was off-limits. He tried to rationalize the sound, to tell himself it was the wind, the old building settling, anything but what he feared it was. But the tapping continued, growing louder, more insistent, as if something were trying to get his attention. Then he heard something else, or a faint, muffled laughter, coming from the same direction as the tapping. It was a low, throaty chuckle, a sound that was both mocking and menacing. He felt a surge of terror, a primal fear that threatened to overwhelm him. He wanted to run, to escape the room, to escape the inn, but he was frozen in place, his legs trembling, his mind racing. The tapping and the laughter continued, growing louder, more insistent, filling the room, pressing in on him. He covered his ears, but the sounds seemed to penetrate his skull, vibrating through his bones. He looked around the room, desperately searching for an explanation, for a way out. His gaze fell upon the window, the heavy shutters locked tight, blocking out the outside world. He had an idea, a desperate, last-ditch attempt to break the silence, to disrupt the oppressive atmosphere of the room. He stumbled towards the window, his hands shaking, and began to bang on the shutters, shouting at the top of his lungs. "Hello!" he yelled. "Is anyone out there? Help me!" His voice echoed in the small room, swallowed by the silence. The tapping and the laughter stopped. He waited, holding his breath, listening. He heard nothing, only the pounding of his own heart. Then he heard a new sound, a slow, creaking sound, coming from the hallway outside his room. It was the sound of a door opening. He knew at that time he should have hid. Leo froze, his back pressed against the shutters, his eyes fixed on the door to his room. The creaking sound continued, growing louder, closer. He could hear slow, deliberate footsteps approaching, the sound of heavy boots on the wooden floor. He knew it was Silas, the innkeeper, but he also knew with a chilling certainty that it was not just Silas. Something had changed, something had shifted. The silence of the inn had been broken, and whatever had been lurking within it was now awake, aware of his presence. The footsteps stopped outside his door. He held his breath, waiting, his body tense, his mind racing. He heard a faint scratching sound, like fingernails scraping against the wood. Then the doorknob began to turn, slowly, deliberately. Leo's heart leaped into his throat. He looked around wildly, searching for a weapon, for a place to hide. But the room was small, sparsely furnished, offering no refuge. The door creaked open, revealing the dark hallway beyond. Silas stood in the doorway, his tall, gaunt figure silhouetted against the faint light. But he was different. His eyes, which had previously been dull and lifeless, now glowed with an unnatural light, a cold, predatory gleam. His mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile, revealing teeth that seemed too long, too sharp. And he was not alone. Standing behind him, shrouded in shadow, were figures tall, thin, and indistinct, their forms shifting and wavering like smoke. They were silent, motionless, but Leo could feel their presence, their cold, watchful gaze. Silas spoke, his voice no longer a whisper, but a deep, resonant growl that seemed to vibrate the very air around him. "You broke the silence," he said. "You disturbed the slumber." Leo tried to speak, to apologize, to explain, but his voice caught in his throat. He could only stare in terror at the figures in the hallway, at the transformed face of the innkeeper. Silas took a step forward, entering the room. The shadowy figures followed him, gliding silently across the floor. "We offered you rest," Silas said, his voice dripping with a strange, unsettling mixture of sadness and menace. "We offered you peace, but you chose noise." Leo backed away, stumbling against the bed, his legs trembling so violently he could barely stand. He felt a cold dread grip him, a sense of utter hopelessness. He knew he was trapped, that there was no escape. The figures surrounded him, their shadows merging with his own, their cold presence suffocating him. He closed his eyes, bracing himself for the inevitable, waiting for the darkness to consume him. He waited to be taken like all the others before him. Leo squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the final blow, for the cold embrace of the shadowy figures. He felt their presence all around him, a suffocating weight pressing in on him, stealing his breath. He braced himself, every muscle tense, expecting pain, expecting oblivion. But nothing happened. The pressure remained, the cold, the sense of dread. But there was no attack, no physical contact. He waited, his heart pounding, his mind racing. Then he heard a voice, a faint whisper, coming from everywhere and nowhere. It was not Silas's voice, nor the guttural murmurs of the shadows. It was a different voice, a softer voice, a voice that seemed to speak directly to his mind. "Open your eyes," the voice whispered. He hesitated, his fear battling with a strange sense of curiosity, of hope. He slowly opened his eyes. The room was still dim, lit only by the faint glow from the hallway. Silas and the shadowy figures were still there, surrounding him, their forms shifting and wavering. But something had changed. The figures were no longer menacing, no longer threatening. They seemed sad, lost, their forms flickering like dying flames. And Silas, he no longer looked like a monster. He looked tired, defeated, his glowing eyes dimmed, his grotesque smile replaced by a weary frown. Leo looked around, confused, his mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. He felt a strange calmness wash over him, a sense of peace that seemed to emanate from the very air around him. The voice whispered again, clearer this time, more distinct. "We are the sleepers," it said, "trapped between worlds, bound to this place. We crave silence, stillness, the peace of oblivion. But the noise keeps us awake." Leo understood now. The inn was not haunted by ghosts, not by demons, but by something else, by restless spirits, trapped in a state of perpetual slumber, their peace disturbed by any sound, any disturbance. Silas was not their master, but their jailer, forced to maintain the silence, to protect them from the noise of the living world. He felt a surge of pity for the sleepers, for their endless, silent suffering. He understood now why Silas had been so insistent on silence, why he had reacted so violently to his noise. He lowered his head, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't know." Silas nodded slowly, his eyes filled with a profound sadness. "Few do," he rasped. "Few understand the price of silence." The shadowy figures began to fade, their forms dissolving into the darkness, their whispers growing fainter until they were gone. Silas remained, his form solidifying, his features returning to normal, the unnatural glow in his eyes extinguished. He looked at Leo, a flicker of gratitude in his weary gaze. "You have brought a moment of peace," he said, his voice hoarse. "Thank you." Leo knew what he had to do. He couldn't stay at the inn, not anymore, but he couldn't leave the sleepers in their torment. He had to find a way to help them, to bring them the true silence they craved. He knew that he would have to return to the world, to the noise, to the chaos. But that meant he had to leave. He was not ready, but he made the choice. He left and would return. Leo gathered his belongings, his movements slow and deliberate. He felt a profound sadness, a weight of responsibility for the sleepers and their endless, silent suffering. He knew he couldn't simply walk away, that he had to do something, anything to help them. He looked at Silas, who was standing by the door, watching him, his expression unreadable. "I'll be back," Leo said, his voice firm, despite the tremor in his hands. "Promise, I'll find a way to help them." Silas nodded slowly, a flicker of something that might have been hope in his eyes. "The silence must be preserved," he rasped. "It is the only way." Leo left the room, walking down the long, dark hallway towards the entrance of the inn. He felt the silence pressing in on him again, but it was different now. It was no longer oppressive, no longer menacing. It was sad, expectant, waiting. He stepped outside, into the cool night air. The fog had lifted, revealing a sky full of stars. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the fresh, clean air, a stark contrast to the stale, heavy atmosphere of the inn. He looked back at the building, its dark, weathered form silhouetted against the starry sky. It looked peaceful, almost serene, but he knew the truth. He knew the suffering that lurked within its walls, the endless, silent torment of the sleepers. He got into his car and started the engine, the sound loud and jarring in the stillness of the night. He drove away, slowly at first, then faster, putting as much distance as possible between himself and the still hollow inn. But he knew he would return. He had made a promise, and he intended to keep it. He would find a way to break the cycle, to silence the noise, to bring true peace to the sleepers, even if it meant sacrificing his own. He had a long journey ahead of him, a journey into the unknown, into the realm of forgotten lore and ancient secrets. He drove through the night, his mind racing, his heart heavy with the weight of his responsibility. He didn't know where to start, what to look for, who to ask for help. But he knew he couldn't give up. He had to find the answers, for the sake of the sleepers, for the sake of Silas, and for the sake of his own sanity. He drove on, the road ahead shrouded in darkness, his destination unknown, his future uncertain. But he was determined, driven by a sense of purpose he had never felt before. He had a mission, a quest, and he would not rest until it was complete. He needed to research, and he would start at the local library in the morning. Leo's first stop was the nearest town, a small, sleepy community several miles from the still hollow inn. He found the local library, a quaint, two-story building with a welcoming atmosphere that was a stark contrast to the oppressive silence of the inn. He spent hours poring over old newspapers, local history books, and genealogical records, searching for any mention of the inn, of Silas, of the sleepers. He found bits and pieces of information, fragmented stories, and whispered rumors, but nothing concrete, nothing that offered a clear explanation or a solution. He learned that the inn had been built in the late 19th century, by a wealthy and eccentric businessman named Elias Thorne. Thorne had been obsessed with silence, with creating a sanctuary where he could escape the noise and chaos of the modern world. He had designed the inn himself, incorporating strange architectural features and using unusual materials, all intended to dampen sound and create an atmosphere of absolute quiet. But Thorne's obsession had gone too far. He had become increasingly reclusive, isolating himself in the inn, refusing to see anyone, to speak to anyone. He had eventually disappeared, leaving behind only rumors and speculation. Some said he had gone mad, driven insane by the silence he had created. Others said he had discovered a way to transcend his physical form, to become one with the silence itself. Still others whispered of a darker fate, of a pact made with unseen forces, of a sacrifice offered in exchange for eternal peace. Leo found no mention of sleepers or shadowy figures, but he did find several accounts of strange occurrences at the inn, unexplained noises, cold spots, feelings of being watched, and a persistent sense of unease that drove away visitors and staff alike. He also found a few references to Silas, describing him as a caretaker, a distant relative of Thorne's, who had inherited the inn and its unsettling legacy. Silas, it seemed, had been a solitary figure, keeping to himself, rarely seen in town, fiercely protective of the inn and its secrets. As Leo pieced together the fragments of information, he began to form a theory. He believed that Thorne, in his quest for absolute silence, had somehow tapped into something beyond human understanding, something that had warped the reality within the inn, trapping the spirits of those who had died there, condemning them to an endless, silent slumber. Silas, he suspected, had been aware of this, and had dedicated his life to maintaining the silence, to protecting the sleepers from further disturbance, even if it meant isolating himself and living a life of lonely servitude. But Leo also realized that the silence was not a solution. It was a prison. The sleepers were not at peace. They were trapped, yearning for release, for the true silence of oblivion. He knew he had to find a way to break the cycle, to free the sleepers, to bring an end to the haunting of the still hollow inn. But how? He had no experience with the paranormal, no knowledge of rituals or exorcisms. He was just a travel blogger, armed with a notebook and a growing sense of dread. He decided that his next step would be to contact Sarah and Mark. Leo remembered Sarah and Mark, the paranormal investigators he'd met at Windrow Farm. He still had Sarah's card tucked away in his wallet. He pulled it out, his fingers trembling slightly, and dialed the number. The phone rang several times, and he was about to hang up when Sarah answered, her voice calm and professional. Sarah Walker speaking. Sarah, it's Daniel Croft from Windrow Farm, he said, his voice hoarse. I need your help again. He explained his situation, his voice growing more frantic as he recounted his experiences at the still hollow inn, the whispers, the footsteps, the shadowy figures, the oppressive silence. He told her about Silas, about Elias Thorne, about his theory of trapped spirits yearning for release. Sarah listened patiently, asking occasional questions, clarifying details. When he was finished, there was a long silence. This sounds complex, she said finally. More complex than Windrow Farm. We're dealing with something that's been established for a very long time, potentially a very powerful entity or entities. I know, Leo said, his voice filled with desperation. But I don't know what else to do. I promised Silas I'd help, and I can't just leave them there, trapped like that. I understand, Sarah said. Give me some time to do some research, to consult with Mark. We'll need to gather more information to understand the specific nature of the haunting, the history of the inn, the rituals that might have been performed there. I've already done some research, Leo said, and he proceeded to tell her about his findings at the local library, about Elias Thorne's obsession with silence and his mysterious disappearance. Sarah listened intently, making notes. This is helpful, she said. It gives us a starting point, but we'll need more. We'll need to examine the inn itself to assess the energy, to try to communicate with whatever's there. I can take you there, Leo said. But be careful. It's not like Windrow Farm. The silence, it's a weapon. It gets inside your head. We'll be prepared. Sarah assured him. We'll bring protective equipment, sound dampening devices, anything we can think of. We'll meet you there in 2 days. Can you handle that? Yes, Leo said, feeling a surge of relief. I can handle it. He hung up the phone, his hands still shaking, but his mind clearer, his resolve strengthened. He had a plan, a team, a glimmer of hope in the overwhelming darkness. He knew it wouldn't be easy, that the still hollow inn would not give up its secrets willingly, but he was ready to face whatever awaited him, to fight for the peace of the sleepers and for his own sanity. He had 2 days to prepare. He knew he couldn't waste them. Leo spent the next 2 days in a state of anxious preparation. He returned to the town library, delving deeper into the local archives, searching for any additional information about Elias Thorne, the Still Hollow Inn, and any reported paranormal activity in the area. He found old newspaper clippings detailing Thorne's eccentric behavior, his growing isolation, and his eventual disappearance, which had been ruled a probable suicide, though his body was never found. He also discovered accounts of strange occurrences at the inn in the years following Thorne's disappearance, reports of unsettling noises, cold spots, apparitions, and a pervasive sense of dread that drove away visitors and staff. The inn had changed hands several times, each owner eventually abandoning it, claiming it was uninhabitable, haunted. Leo also researched methods of spirit communication, protection rituals, and banishing techniques, filling his notebook with scribbled notes and diagrams. He felt overwhelmed by the sheer volume of information, much of it contradictory and unreliable, but he was determined to learn everything he could, to be as prepared as possible for his encounter with whatever lurked within the Still Hollow Inn. He gathered supplies, candles, salt, sage, crystals, and a small, antique silver bell he found in a pawn shop, remembering his grandfather, Silas, mentioning the protective properties of silver. He also purchased a high-quality digital recorder, hoping to capture any evidence of the whispers, the footsteps, the other unexplained sounds he had experienced. He barely slept, his mind racing, his body tense with anticipation and fear. He kept replaying his experiences at the inn, the oppressive silence, the shadowy figures, Silas's haunted eyes, the feeling of being watched, of being surrounded by something unseen and malevolent. Finally, the day arrived. Leo drove back to the Still Hollow Inn, his car loaded with equipment and supplies. The drive felt longer this time, the road more treacherous, the forest more menacing. The fog had returned, thicker than before, shrouding the landscape in a ghostly silence. He parked his car in front of the inn, the same spot he had occupied before. The building looked even more dilapidated, more forbidding, in the pale light of the overcast sky. He felt a knot of fear tighten in his stomach, but he forced himself to get out of the car, to face his fear, to fulfill his promise. He saw Sarah and Mark's van already parked nearby, their figures silhouetted against the fog. He took a deep breath, steeling his nerves, and walked towards them, ready to confront the secrets of the Still Hollow Inn, ready to fight for the silence, for the peace of the sleepers, and for his own soul. He was not looking forward to what came next. Sarah and Mark greeted Leo with somber nods, their expressions reflecting the gravity of the situation. They had already begun unloading their equipment, setting up cameras and sensors around the perimeter of the inn. "We've done some preliminary readings," Sarah said, her voice low. "There's a significant energy field surrounding the building, highly localized, but incredibly strong. It's chaotic, unstable, like a tightly wound spring about to snap." Mark added, "The historical records corroborate your findings, Leo. Elias Thorne was deeply involved in occult practices, specifically focused on sound manipulation and the creation of silent spaces. He believed that absolute silence was a gateway to another dimension, a realm of pure consciousness." Leo shivered, despite himself. He was trying to, what? Contact something? Summon something? Perhaps, Mark said. Or perhaps he was simply trying to escape the noise of the world, to create a sanctuary for himself. But he clearly went too far. He disrupted something, created an imbalance. Sarah nodded. We believe the sleepers are the residual energies of those who died within the inn, their consciousness trapped in a state of perpetual slumber, unable to move on, unable to find peace. The silence Thorn craved is their prison. And Silas, Leo asked, what was his role in all this? He was the gatekeeper, Sarah explained. He understood, at least partially, the nature of the haunting. He maintained the silence, not to appease the sleepers, but to contain them, to prevent them from spilling out. But why the whispers? The footsteps? Leo asked. That doesn't sound like silence. That's the paradox, Mark said. The sleepers crave silence, but they are also driven to break it, to communicate, to express their suffering. It's a constant struggle, a cycle of suppression and release. They entered the inn, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The air inside was heavy, cold, and still, the silence almost palpable. Leo felt the familiar pressure in his chest, the sense of being watched, of being surrounded. Sarah set up a series of sensors in the main reception area, devices designed to detect fluctuations in electromagnetic fields, temperature, and sound. Mark began to examine the walls, the floors, the ceilings, searching for any physical clues, any signs of Thorn's occult practices. Leo, armed with his digital recorder and his grandfather's silver bell, walked down the hallway towards room 7, the room where he had experienced the most intense activity. He felt a knot of fear tighten in his stomach, but he forced himself to keep moving, to confront the darkness that awaited him. He reached the door, his heart was pounding fast. Leo hesitated outside room 7, his hand hovering over the doorknob. He could feel the cold emanating from within, the oppressive silence pressing against him like a physical weight. He took a deep breath, steeling his nerves, and pushed the door open. The room was, as he remembered it, small, sparsely furnished. The window shutters still locked tight, but the atmosphere was different. It was even colder, even more silent than before. The air felt thick, heavy, as if it were charged with an unseen energy. He stepped inside, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. He saw the bed, the chair, the empty walls. He saw nothing unusual, nothing out of place. But he felt it, the presence, the watchful gaze of the sleepers. He raised his digital recorder, pressing the record button. "This is Leo Croft," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I'm in room 7 of the Still Hollow Inn. I'm here to try to communicate with the sleepers." He paused, listening. The only sound was the faint hiss of the recorder. He continued, his voice growing stronger. "I know you're here. I know you're trapped. I want to help you. I want to bring you peace." He waited, his breath held, his eyes scanning the room. He saw nothing, heard nothing. He was about to give up, to dismiss it all as a delusion, when he heard it. A faint whisper, so soft he almost missed it, coming from the corner of the room, near the window. He moved closer, his flashlight beam focused on the spot. He saw nothing but the bare wall, the dusty floor. But the whisper continued, growing slightly louder, more distinct. He held the recorder closer, trying to capture the sound. He could make out a few words now, fragmented phrases whispered in a language he didn't understand. "Trapped," the whisper said. Cold, dark silence. Then he heard another sound, a faint, rhythmic tapping, coming from above, from the ceiling. It was the same sound he had heard before, the sound of footsteps on the non-existent floor above. He looked up, his flashlight beam illuminating the ceiling. He saw nothing but the old, cracked plaster. But the tapping continued, growing louder, more insistent. And then he saw it, a shadow, forming on the wall, near the ceiling. It was a faint, indistinct shadow at first, but it grew steadily darker, more defined. It took on the shape of a human figure, tall and thin, its limbs elongated, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It was one of the sleepers. The figure began to move, gliding slowly across the wall, its form shifting and wavering like smoke. It reached out a long, skeletal hand towards Leo. He knew he had to do something fast. Leo recoiled, stumbling backward, away from the approaching shadow. He felt a surge of terror, but he also remembered his purpose, his promise to Silas. He had to help the sleepers, not run from them. He remembered the silver bell he had brought, his grandfather's supposed protection. He fumbled in his pocket, pulling it out, his fingers trembling. He held the bell out in front of him, towards the shadowy figure, and rang it. The sound of the bell, clear and resonant, filled the small room, cutting through the oppressive silence. The shadow figure hesitated, its form flickering slightly, as if recoiling from the sound. Leo rang the bell again, louder this time, holding it steady, his fear battling with a growing sense of determination. The shadow figure began to fade, its form becoming less distinct, its movements less fluid. The whispers, which had intensified as the figure approached, began to diminish, to soften, to become less frantic. The tapping from the ceiling ceased. Leo continued to ring the bell, his arm aching, his ears ringing with the sound. He closed his eyes, focusing on the image of peace, of release, of a quiet, restful sleep. He visualized the sleepers, no longer trapped, no longer tormented, but free, at peace, finally able to rest. He opened his eyes. The shadowy figure was gone. The room was silent, empty, except for the faint echo of the bell. He lowered the bell, his hands still trembling, his body exhausted. He felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it was tempered by a profound sadness, a sense of the suffering he had witnessed. He knew he hadn't solved the problem completely. He had only provided a temporary reprieve, a moment of peace for the sleepers. He needed to find a way to break the cycle, to release them from their eternal slumber. He heard footsteps in the hallway, and Sarah and Mark rushed into the room, their faces filled with concern. "Leo, are you all right?" Sarah asked, her voice anxious. "We heard the bell, and the sensors went wild. The energy levels spiked off the charts." Leo nodded, his voice hoarse. I think I made contact," he said, "with one of the sleepers. It was intense." He explained what had happened, the shadowy figure, the whispers, the tapping, the effect of the silver bell. Sarah and Mark listened intently, their expressions a mixture of fascination and apprehension. "The bell, it's a disruption," Mark said, his brow furrowed. "It's creating a frequency that interferes with the entity's manifestation, but it's not a permanent solution. We need to find the source," Sarah said. "The root of the haunting. Something Thorn did, some ritual, some object that's anchoring the sleepers to this place." They decided to search the inn, systematically, room by room, looking for any clues, any evidence of Thorn's occult practices. They had a long night ahead of them. They knew the dangers, but were ready. The three of them, Leo, Sarah, and Mark, began their search of the still hollow inn. They moved cautiously, methodically, checking every room, every closet, every nook and cranny. Sarah used her sensors to detect energy fluctuations. Mark examined the walls and floors for hidden compartments or markings, and Leo, still clutching the silver bell, acted as a kind of lightning rod, his heightened sensitivity to the sleepers guiding them towards areas of increased activity. They found more strange occurrences, objects moving on their own, cold spots that defied explanation, faint whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. But they found no definitive answers, no clear indication of what had caused the haunting or how to stop it. They eventually reached the end of the hallway, the door that Leo had noticed before, the one without a number, the one that had been locked during his previous visits. This time, the door was slightly ajar. Leo felt a chill run down his spine. He knew with a certainty that defied logic that this was it. This was the source, the heart of the darkness that permeated the inn. He exchanged a look with Sarah and Mark, their faces reflecting his own mixture of fear and determination. They nodded, a silent agreement to proceed, to face whatever awaited them behind that door. Leo reached out, his hand trembling, and pushed the door open. The room beyond was small and circular, unlike any other room in the inn. The walls were lined with bookshelves, filled with ancient, leather-bound tomes. In the center of the room stood a large stone altar, its surface covered in strange symbols and markings. And on the altar lay a single object, a human skull, its empty eye sockets staring up at the ceiling. The air in the room was heavy, suffocating, charged with an energy that made Leo's skin crawl. He felt a pressure in his head, a sense of being watched, of being judged. The silence was absolute, broken only by the faint, rhythmic pulsing of his own blood in his ears. It had to be the room. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "This is a ritual chamber," she whispered, "a place of power and darkness." Mark moved forward, his eyes scanning the bookshelves, his fingers tracing the spines of the ancient tomes. "These books, they're not ordinary," he said. "They're grimoires, texts of forbidden knowledge, of occult rituals, of necromancy." Leo felt a cold dread grip him. He understood now. Elias Thorne hadn't just been seeking silence. He had been seeking power, the power to control life and death, the power to manipulate the very fabric of reality. And he had found it here in this room, through these forbidden texts, through the rituals he had performed on this altar. The skull on the altar seemed to stare at Leo, its empty sockets burning into his soul. He felt a strange connection to it, a sense of recognition. He realized, with a chilling certainty, that it was Thorne's skull, the remains of the man who had unleashed this darkness upon the inn. Sarah approached the altar cautiously, her sensors clicking and whirring. "The energy here is overwhelming," she said. "It's like a vortex, a swirling mass of trapped souls, of frustrated desires, of endless suffering." She pointed to the symbols on the altar. "These are binding symbols," she said. "Thorne used them to trap the spirits, to bind them to this place, to feed his own power." Leo understood now. The sleepers were not just the victims of the inn's haunting. They were the source of its power. Thorne had created a cycle of suffering, a perpetual engine of negative energy, fueled by the trapped souls of those who had died within the inn's walls. He looked at the skull again, at the empty eye sockets, at the silent testament to Thorne's ambition and his ultimate failure. He felt a surge of anger, of righteous indignation, at the injustice, the cruelty, the sheer arrogance of the man. He knew what he had to do. He had to break the cycle, to release the sleepers, to destroy the source of the haunting. He had to destroy the altar, the books, the skull, everything. He began to devise a plan. "We need to disrupt the energy flow," Sarah said, breaking Leo's train of thought. "We need to break the binding symbols, to release the trapped spirits." Mark nodded in agreement. "And we need to destroy the focus," he said, pointing to the skull. "That's likely the anchor, the object that's holding the whole structure together." Leo looked at the altar, at the intricate web of symbols, at the skull that seemed to mock him with its silent grin. He felt a surge of determination, a resolve to end this, to bring peace to the sleepers, to finally silence the whispers of the still hollow inn. "We'll need fire," he said, his voice firm, "and a lot of it." They gathered what they could find: old, dry wood from broken furniture, scraps of paper from the bookshelves, and a bottle of flammable liquid that Mark carried in his kit, intended for cleansing ritual spaces. They carefully arranged the materials around the altar, creating a pyre that would engulf the skull, the symbols, and the surrounding area. Sarah used a marker to draw counter symbols on the floor, creating a protective circle around themselves, a barrier against the dark energy that permeated the room. As they worked, the air grew colder, the silence more oppressive. They could feel the presence of the sleepers, a swirling mass of unseen energy that pressed in on them, resisting their efforts. Finally, they were ready. Leo stood before the altar, holding a lighter in his trembling hand. He looked at Sarah and Mark, their faces pale but determined. They nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the risk they were taking, of the potential consequences of their actions. He took a deep breath and lit the fire. The flames leaped up, catching quickly on the dry wood and paper. The room filled with heat and light, pushing back the darkness, disrupting the oppressive silence. As the fire grew stronger, the symbols on the altar began to glow, to writhe, as if they were alive. The skull seemed to grin even wider, its empty sockets burning with an eerie, internal light. The whispers returned, louder than ever, a cacophony of voices screaming, pleading, cursing. The air vibrated with unseen energy, and the room seemed to shake, to tremble, as if the very foundations of the inn were about to collapse. Leo, Sarah, and Mark stood firm, within their protective circle, watching as the fire consumed the altar, as the symbols shattered, as the skull cracked and crumbled into dust. They were prepared to see this through. The fire raged, consuming the altar, the books, the skull, everything within its reach. The heat was intense, almost unbearable, but Leo, Sarah, and Mark stood their ground, their eyes fixed on the inferno, their minds focused on their purpose. As the flames reached their peak, a blinding light erupted from the center of the pyre, a surge of energy that filled the room, shaking the very walls of the inn. Leo, Sarah, and Mark shielded their eyes, bracing themselves against the force of the blast. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The light subsided, the fire died down, leaving behind only smoldering embers and a cloud of acrid smoke. The whispers were gone. The oppressive silence had lifted, replaced by the faint crackling of the dying flames. Leo, Sarah, and Mark slowly lowered their arms, their eyes blinking in the sudden dimness. They looked around, their senses reeling from the intensity of the experience. The altar was destroyed, reduced to a pile of charred rubble. The skull was gone, its remains indistinguishable from the ashes. The bookshelves were blackened and crumbling, the ancient tomes reduced to cinders. The room was still silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was not the oppressive, suffocating silence of the sleepers, but a peaceful, natural silence, the silence of emptiness, of release. They had done it. They had broken the cycle, freed the trapped spirits, silenced the whispers of the still, hollow inn. They stood there for a long moment, breathing deeply, letting the reality of their accomplishment sink in. They had faced the darkness, and they had prevailed. Sarah was the first to speak, her voice hoarse but filled with relief. "It's over," she said. "They're gone." Mark nodded, his face pale but his eyes shining with a mixture of exhaustion and triumph. The energy, it's dissipated. The binding symbols, they're broken. Leo looked around the room, his gaze lingering on the pile of ashes that was once the altar. He felt a profound sadness, a sense of loss, for the sleepers, for the suffering they had endured. But he also felt a sense of peace, of closure, knowing that he had helped them find their rest. They left the room, leaving the ruins of the ritual chamber behind. They walked through the silent inn, towards the entrance, their footsteps echoing in the emptiness. As they stepped outside, into the dawn light, they felt a gentle breeze on their faces, a sense of freshness, of renewal. The fog had lifted, revealing a clear blue sky. The silence remained, but it was no longer unsettling, no longer oppressive. It was the silence of peace, of tranquility, of a place finally at rest. The still hollow inn was quiet, the tides toll. Old Man Hemlock, the lighthouse keeper, had warned me. "Don't go near the sunken village, lad," he'd croaked, his voice raspy from years of salt air and solitude. "When the tide recedes, it ain't just sand and stone it reveals. Some things are best left drowned." But I, young and foolish and obsessed with local legends, hadn't listened. I'd come to this remote stretch of coastline seeking the truth behind the tales of Port Blossom, the village swallowed by the sea a century ago. I arrived at low tide as the waters retreated, revealing a landscape of mud, shattered stone, and decaying wood. The air was thick with the stench of brine and something else, something ancient and unsettling. The sun, a pale disk in the overcast sky, cast long, eerie shadows across the ruins. I carried a small satchel containing my essentials: a notebook, a pen, a camera, and a flask of strong, black coffee. I was determined to document everything I saw, to prove that Port Blossom was more than just a myth, a fisherman's tale. I picked my way carefully across the slippery rocks and mud, my boots sinking into the soft sand. The remains of the village were scattered before me, a ghostly outline of what had once been a thriving community. I saw the foundations of houses, the remnants of a church steeple, the broken timbers of fishing boats. The silence was profound, broken only by the cries of gulls and the gentle lapping of the waves. It was a silence that felt heavy, expectant, as if the very air were holding its breath. I began to explore, my eyes scanning the ruins, my pen scribbling notes in my pad. I sketched the layout of the village, noting the positions of buildings, the patterns of the debris. I took photographs, capturing the eerie beauty of the submerged world. Then I heard it, a faint sound, carried on the breeze, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was a whispering, a murmuring, a chorus of voices speaking in a language I didn't understand. I stopped, my heart pounding, and listened. The whispering continued, growing slightly louder, more distinct. It seemed to be coming from the water, from the ruins themselves, from the very air around me. I was not alone. I tried to dismiss the whispers as the sound of the tide, the wind playing through the ruins, anything but what my instincts were telling me. I was a rational man, a skeptic, not prone to flights of fancy, but the sounds were too distinct, too human to be dismissed so easily. I continued my exploration, moving deeper into the heart of the sunken village. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and I began to make out fragmented words, phrases in a guttural, unfamiliar tongue. They seemed to be calling to me, beckoning me closer, inviting me to join them. I came to a large, open space that must have been the village square. In the center, partially submerged in the mud, was a stone well, its walls crumbling, its opening dark and ominous. The whispers were strongest here, emanating from the well itself, a chorus of voices rising and falling like the tide. I felt a strange compulsion to approach, to peer into the darkness, to discover the source of the sounds. I took a step forward, then another, my boots sinking deeper into the mud. I reached the edge of the well and leaned over, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. I saw nothing but dark water, reflecting the pale sky above. But the whispers continued, swirling around me, drawing me in. I felt a dizzying sensation, a loss of balance, as if the ground were shifting beneath my feet. Then I saw something in the water, a faint movement, a ripple on the surface, a glimpse of something pale and shapeless. It vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving me questioning my own senses. I blinked, shook my head, and looked again. This time I saw more than just a movement. I saw faces, or rather, the suggestion of faces, swirling in the murky water. They were pale and distorted, their features blurred, their eyes wide and empty. They were looking at me. I recoiled, stumbling backward, my heart pounding in my chest. I felt a wave of nausea, a cold dread that gripped me to the core. I knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that these were the faces of the drowned, the lost souls of Port Blossom, trapped within the watery depths of their former home. They were not at peace. I scrambled away from the well, my boots slipping on the wet mud, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I wanted to run, to escape the ruins, to put as much distance as possible between myself and those watery faces. But my legs felt heavy, my movements sluggish, as if I were wading through a thick, viscous fluid. The whispers intensified, swirling around me, a cacophony of voices that seemed to penetrate my very skull. They were no longer beckoning, no longer inviting. They were angry, resentful. their tone shifting from a mournful plea to a threatening growl. I realized that I had disturbed them, that my presence had awakened something ancient and malevolent, something that had been slumbering beneath the waves for a century. I had trespassed on their domain, and now they wanted me to pay the price. I looked around, desperately searching for a way out, for a path back to the shore. But the ruins seemed to have shifted, rearranged themselves, blocking my escape. The walls of the houses loomed taller, the streets narrower, the shadows deeper. I felt a cold touch on my ankle, a slimy grip that tightened around my leg. I cried out, kicking instinctively, trying to free myself. I looked down and saw nothing. There was nothing there, only the mud and the water. But the grip remained, cold and relentless, pulling me down. I struggled, thrashing wildly, my boots sinking deeper into the mud. I felt another touch on my other leg, and another on my arms, my chest. They were all around me, invisible hands pulling me down, dragging me towards the watery depths. I screamed, a wordless cry of terror, but my voice was swallowed by the whispers, by the rising tide, by the relentless pull of the drowned. I knew I was doomed. I fought with every ounce of strength I had left, but it was no use. The invisible hands were too strong, their grip too tight. I was being dragged down inexorably into the cold, murky water. I thrashed, I kicked, I clawed at the mud, but it was like fighting quicksand. The more I struggled, the faster I sank. The water rose around me, filling my boots, soaking my clothes, chilling me to the bone. I gasped for air, my lungs burning, my head spinning. I could taste the salt water, the mud, the decay. I could feel the cold, slimy hands all over me, pulling me down, down, down. I saw the faces again, swirling around me in the murky water, their pale, distorted features illuminated by the fading light from above. They were no longer mournful, no longer pleading. They were triumphant, their empty eyes gleaming with a cold, malevolent joy. They were claiming me, adding me to their ranks, making me one of them. I closed my eyes, surrendering to the inevitable. I felt a strange sense of peace, a release from the struggle, from the fear. The cold no longer bothered me. The whispers faded, replaced by a profound silence. The last thing I saw, before the darkness consumed me, was the faint, shimmering outline of the village above. The broken walls, the empty windows, the ghostly remnants of a life that had been swallowed by the sea. And then, there was only darkness. The next day, at low tide, Old Man Hemlock, the lighthouse keeper, walked along the shore, his eyes scanning the ruins of Port Blossom. He saw nothing unusual, only the mud, the shattered stone, the decaying wood. The village remained, silent and empty, its secrets buried beneath the waves. He found a small satchel, washed up on the sand, its contents scattered nearby: a notebook, a pen, a camera, a flask of cold, black coffee. He recognized the belongings of the young man who had ignored his warnings, the young man who had sought the truth behind the legends. He shook his head sadly, his heart heavy with the weight of unspoken words. He knew that the tide always took its toll, that some secrets were best left undisturbed, that some villages were meant to remain drowned. He picked up the notebook and saw his name written. He looked out to the sea and went home. The tide was coming back in.